for food securities and nutrition. With this workstream, the committee recognizes the need to strengthen national data system to increase availability and access to timely and reliable food securities and nutrition data. The access to relevant information across all levels of production allow for optimal production, diversities, security, speed, reliability, and efficiency. Many countries, despite all efforts, do not meet the minimum data requirements, lack sustainable data system, and have insufficient capacity to analyze, use, and disseminate data at their disposal. Addressing the gap in quality and quantity of data is also essential to monitor progress and understand where the world stands in achieving SDG 2 and other goals and targets. More needs to be done at the global level to support the process of laying the groundwork for informed decision-making, setting standards for improved data-driven policies around food securities and nutrition, and strengthening effective monitoring, reviews, and follow-up to deliver SDG 2. Of course, data sources are wide and varied and should be collected and utilized with an eye toward transparency, openness, and consistent with legal standards and relevant human rights principles. Through this workstream, the Committee on the Food Security CFS wants to develop actionable policy recommendations that will strengthen the capacities of countries to produce, analyze, use, and disseminate food securities and nutrition data, and will improve critical decision-making around food securities and nutrition policies. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank the CFS Secretariat. And you have worked a lot to make sure that we can launch this webinar, and also to make sure that we can deliver better work of the committees to our members and other stakeholders. And also I would like to thank again for your participations here today to kickstart this conversation. And I wish you have a fruitful discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the welcome remarks and for joining us slightly late in the day, your time in Bangkok. We'll now turn to our keynote speaker, the FAO Chief Economist, Máximo Torero, who will be telling us a bit about the challenge that's common to most countries in the world, actually all, if not all. And the challenge is the difficulty to make decisions on agriculture and food security when data is scarce and unreliable. Máximo, please tell us more.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity for us to present an overall picture of what are the challenges, especially in the moment that we are living today, which is so central because of what we are observing on COVID-19 and how important data could be and is to be able to target better interventions and to be able to resolve and to clear market information. So good morning and afternoon to all, and evening everyone, and thanks for joining this CFS event to discuss how we collectively contribute to close data gaps and promote evidence-informed decision-making for food security and nutrition. During my presentation, I will make the case for more and better data and statistics to achieve food security and nutrition by showing some of the key data gaps that are impair effective decision-making, the root causes, and potential solutions to address them. And the concept I want to bring across the presentation is cost effectiveness. Having good data can allow us to make effective decisions and minimize substantial costs in the future. So we always need to think on how to bring this to present value. And normally, ministers of finance and donors don't realize that. And it's very important to bring this up. First of all, if we want to achieve food security and nutrition for all, it is imperative to accelerate actions at 3 levels. Improve access to and consumption of safe and nutritious food, which in turn entails a need to increase availability of safe and nutritious food, make food more affordable, reduce inequities in food access, and create better food environment. Second, build resilience to vulnerability, shocks, and stress that undermines the stability of agri-food systems and food security. And third, transition into more equitable, productive, sustainable, and responsible agri-food systems from farm to fork. These necessary actions are already captured in the 2030 Agenda, in particular in SDG 2, and find echoes in ambitious of the action areas of the UN Food System Summit. Their implementation, however, relies on the identification and execution of the most effective solutions by all stakeholders, from policymakers to investors, private sector, actors to consumers, researchers to civil society and international organizations. And without data, this will be honestly impossible. Here are some examples of where data are needed the most. For decision makers, in particular policymakers, researchers and investors need highly quality and granular data on access to safe and nutritious food and food consumption at the individual level to allow multidimensional analysis on drivers, enablers, and barriers. Farms to study gaps in productivity, sustainable agriculture, and equitable access to means of production and markets. Sustainability of food value chains beyond farm level and contribution of its actors to advance food security and nutrition. Example, food loss and waste, we need to keep tracking that. Climate change. Public and private investments in agri-food systems and their impacts in advancing the key priorities mentioned. They also need timely and granular data and statistics to prevent, maintain functionality during, and more rapidly recover to a better off state from crises, shocks, and stress, such as pandemic, pests, natural disasters, climate extreme, economic crisis, political unrest, and conflicts. More evidence on innovative solutions, their success factors, and their impact to accelerate uptake, in particular from the private sector. And macro-level coherent and comparable data to measure global, regional, and national progress on international commitments and goals. There is significant level of data that we need to be able to make these decisions. Let us make a brief overview of the status of the basic data that is needed to inform the status of food security and nutrition. Some of the indicators that inform the state of food security of the world and are also recognized as sustainable development indicators are the ones that comes from the use of the Food Insecurity Experience Scale, the FIES, which is a theoretically sound and empirically valid household or individual food security measurement system that can explore a range of food insecurity severity levels, be analyzed in a way that ensures cross-country and over-time comparability. Despite being an SDG indicator, currently the data gaps are still important, as you can observe in the map. Data is available for 109 countries covering 46% of the world population. More importantly, there are important gaps in important places such as Middle and Western Africa, South Asia, and SEATs. And finally, out of the 109 countries, only 25 collected data through their national statistical systems. Still more efforts are needed to fill the important gap, and we need to bring this to the national statistics so that we can ensure sustainability and continuity. Now, this data, for example, is crucial to identify where the new hotspots of food insecurity are. Severe, which is the extreme situation linked to our chronic undernourishment measure, or moderate and severe, which includes all forms of malnutrition. Today, we know that because of not collecting this data, many of the social programs and the cash transfer programs didn't target properly their interventions to the new hotspots of food insecurity. So again, the cost economic return of investing small amounts of money, relatively speaking, to collect this data has created a significant misuse of resources, which has a significant cost. Something very important to think and to have in mind. Data on agricultural production is key to inform food availability, one determinant of food insecurity and nutrition. FAO collects this data from official sources around the world through annual questionnaires. Nevertheless, globally, there is no official data for around 30% of countries, as can be seen in the map. And if take a look across regions, we find that the lack of data of ag production is alarming in Africa, where 50% of the countries do not report official data. On the other side, data of trade is essential to inform food availability and to assess the resilience of markets to crisis. Countries report this data to the UN Comtrade database. Nevertheless, the information that countries report is not timely. For example, this database shows that in years such as 2019, which should be close in terms of reporting, 35%, only 35% of the countries did not report data for 2019. In general, the available trade data is deteriorating over time and significantly less available for regions such as Africa and Western Asia. Again, think on the cost-benefit analysis. We have a problem of lockdowns, we have a problem of lack of mobility of data, and we don't know how much data could be traded. We even don't know how much benefit we will get from interregional trade agreements because we don't have the trade data available. And that again has a huge cost and doesn't allow us to make proper decisions. Regions and sub-regions and countries cannot evaluate, for example, the benefits of a free trade agreement in Africa, which has been clear for intra-regional trade. These slides present the status of the data on nutrition, stunting, wasting, and overweight for children under 5, which is key for effective policy making. Here, the situation is even more precarious. 54% of countries have not collected data on nutrition for children under 5 in the period of 2015 and 2020. And 28% of the countries have collected only one data point in the period 2015 and 2020. For this reason, our colleagues in WHO and UNICEF have developed modeling estimates in order to proxy the nutritional situation of children for a given year and a given country. This scenario is even worse for indicators such as adult obesity, breastfeeding, and anemia. This is really not acceptable, no? And as I have been mentioned, if we don't have this information, no matter how much we invest in creating models to simulate the impacts, and if we don't have more than one point in time, all the modeling exercises have significant potential errors of estimation. How a country can make a decision to, for example, develop budget by incentives, where the incentives are linked to improvement in undernourishment, to improvement in nutrition, to improvement in issues of wasting and overweight, if we don't have the data available. We know that the incentive through incentives, through results, has proven to be successful. But if the indicators are not clear and the data is not there, we won't be able to get that benefit from that instrument. So it's another case where we are not really taking seriously the cost benefit of having this information available. In this area, it seems that good data, statistical tools are available to prevent and act upon crises. For example, the APC Global Platform provides timely data on food insecurity and malnutrition situation and their key drivers, which is used by many governments, international organizations, and NGOs for food security analysis and response. FAO Global Information and Early Warning Systems on Food and Agriculture continuously monitors food supply and demand and other key indicators for assessing the overall food security situation in all countries of the world. It issues regular analytical and objective reports on prevailing conditions and provides early warnings of impending food crises at country regional level. There are also several data systems and platforms to monitor and manage pests, such as the fall armyworm monitoring and early warning system, the FAME News, and the Desert Locust Watch and Hub, which we have been investing substantial resources in the last years to be able to accelerate and to improve the quality of this information and the predicting capability of this information. Finally, FAO, through tools developed by the Big Data Lab, which we launched 1 year ago, provide daily information on COVID-19 impacts on food value chains. To build resilience, however, we need more data that will support national governments and other actors to help countries recover from vulnerability, shocks, and stress to a better off stage. And this requires more structural and granular information on the economy, the population, the agriculture, and the environment. Data is more scarce in these areas. This is just to give you an example of how we can use this type of data to be able to measure the targeting. This is the severe food insecurity scale on the map in the left. The darker the color, the higher the food insecurity. On the right, you have the multidimensional poverty index, and in the bottom, you have the food emergency areas. As you can see, and the point I was making before, in the middle of this country, there is a significant new hotspots of severe food insecurity, which not necessarily was the typical food emergency areas, nor the multidimensional poverty areas. That's why having this information disaggregated at a subnational level could provide a significant input for governments to make more decisions and better decisions. And when we look across how the deployment of the cash transfer has happened, they only increase intensity of the cash transfers in the traditional places, and they didn't target properly because they didn't collect this data. And that's another, again, the importance of having cost-effective measures and using this data as a way to minimize those problems. If we look at the status of agricultural statistics, we notice that despite an increase in the perception in the percentage of countries that have conducted or will likely conduct an agricultural census in 2020 census round compared to the previous round, there are still 29% of the countries that will probably not collect up-to-date structural information on the agricultural sector during the current 10-year period. We also estimate from our 2018-19 SDG gap assessment that about 40% of the countries does not have an annual agricultural survey that allows them to collect regular and good quality information on agricultural annual production, livelihoods and productivity of farmers, agricultural practices, and agricultural labor, among others. Other examples of key gaps concern the availability of SDG indicators that are related to food security and nutrition, such as productivity and income of smallholders, land under productive and sustainable agriculture, secure rights of agricultural land by sex, and the food loss and waste indices. Now, just focus on the censuses. If we don't have censuses, we don't have sampling frameworks over which to make the new collection of new data. So again, another big challenge. Now, having reviewed the status of data on food and agriculture, let us consider for a minute what is that drives the scarcity of data in the first place. While there are multiple factors that explain the scarcity of food and agricultural data, I would like to highlight three broad categories: low statistical capacities, human capital is central, lack of funding on data and statistics, and a weak data dissemination and use culture in many national statistical offices. First, with regards to the unequal statistical capacities across countries, this can be clearly seen from the low overall reporting rate of countries on the 21 SDG indicators and the FAO custodianship, which currently stand in 51.5% up to 32% in 2019. Low statistical capacities is typically a result of limited number of staff, low technical and managerial skills, poor statistical infrastructure, poor coordination among data producers, and weak regulatory frameworks. In addition, we need to understand that there is a persistent lack of funding on data and statistics in general, and even more in agricultural statistics. Multiple reports by a number of international agencies have shown that official statistics are perennially underfunded, currently attracting a mere 0.34% of total official development assistance, or ODA. 0.34%. Again, thinking the cost-benefit issue. Some of you may also have heard that SDG indicators 17.18.3, which measures the number of countries with a national statistical plan that is fully funded under implementation. Did you know that the number of countries with a fully funded national statistical plan in 2020 was only 84? This is less than half of the countries in the world. And on top of that, this number has actually gone down from 92 countries in 2019. Third, food and agricultural data, even when available, are not being properly disseminated or used. And this is central, because if we disseminate data, we improve quality. And we also understand if that data that we're collecting is useful. And in many cases, we still collect traditional data that not necessarily is useful and is responding to the needs. So we need to increase the quality of the dissemination of data to be able to get the results that we are looking for. All these problems put together may paint a doubting picture, yet there are a number of specific solutions that we can and should implement. Broadly speaking, we need to scale up and upgrade capacity development interventions and invest in new alternatives of data sources. Scaling up and upgrading capacity development interventions includes, for example, new technologies and trying to use new data to be able to collect this information. Delivering technical and technical capacities, delivering training and technical assistance to countries. In terms of new alternative of data sources, such as geospatial data, big data, we need to recall these are not a panacea, but again can complement and can also help to validate the information we are collecting. So we need to invest in this to be able to get the results. Now, as a solution to the problem described, international organizations, among them FAO, the World Bank, and IFAD, I am all of them present today, have partnered with donors such as Gates Foundation, USAID, the EU, and international cooperation agencies of Germany, Australia, and Italy to create the 50 by 2030 initiative, which is the biggest project ever designed for supporting countries to strengthen their agricultural statistics. There are two basic goals in initiatives supported by 50 countries, by 50 countries by 2030 to collect and disseminate agricultural and rural statistics, and to increase and sustain evidence-based decision-making by promoting the use of data. In this sense, apart from the support to data collection, there's an important support to countries to strengthen their capacities to use and analyze the data at the level of the offices in charge of policy design and modeling. Now, in order to fill the gaps, the initiative is based on an integrated agricultural survey program with an annual core survey, periodic rational modules, and household livelihood and rural surveys in rural areas. This is bringing together household level data and agricultural level data, which is crucial and something that we need to keep accelerating. A solution to fill the data gaps needs to take into account the fact that there is data out there, usually coming in unstructured ways, that can be combined with innovative methods to create information that is relevant for food security, nutrition, and food system transformation. Organizations, national and international, need to engage this with data and methods considering described crisis.
I apologize for interrupting, but the interpreters are requesting that you go a little slower. Thank you.
Describe crisis of traditional data collecting systems which are facing challenges, such as budget reductions and emergencies that cause data gaps. FAO created in 2020 the Data Lab for Statistical Innovation, which is try to fill these gaps by modernizing how we collect this new information. Essentially, what we are trying to do is to try to improve timeliness and granularity of the data collection. This has been central in the COVID-19. We're trying to produce automated analysis, and we're trying to provide early warning signals. And for that, we're using new technologies, web scraping, text mining, geospatial data, artificial intelligence, and of course, big data by using social media and online newspaper articles. This has proven to be very effective. Like, for example, today we can provide daily prices of food to many countries on different types of foods that before we couldn't. We can also track, for example, mobility of vessels. We can track financial situations of agrofinance institutions. So many assets that can be provided with this type of information. Some examples of applications building the data lab using web scraping and text mining techniques are, for example, the food loss and waste index, which is central. That's an area that we need to change. 1/3, 14% of losses, 17% of waste is being lost and not being consumed in a world where we have 3 billion people that don't have access to healthy diets. So we need to find ways to collect this type of information, and this data lab has allowed us to collect this information. Also, we can have sentiment analysis of social and unrest analysis, which allow us to target areas where we are observing social unrest because, for example, of significant food insecurity. NSOs in developing countries also struggle to produce accurate, timely, and disaggregated agricultural statistics and agricultural-related SDG indicators. Within the process of data evolution and modernization of natural statistics systems, Earth observations data is one of the key alternative sources that can facilitate the statistical reporting. The main advantage of Earth observation data are its complete geographical coverage, high spatial resolution, and frequent data acquisitions and low cost. Some solutions to fill the gaps using Earth observations are stated here. For example, we can use it for real-time estimation of crop acreage, crop yield, early warning food security monitoring and detection of drought, plant disease, invasive species, precision farming, which is something which is core for smallholders. If some producers have to have precision agriculture, it's smallholders, because they are the ones that have the biggest restriction in terms of financial resources. So they are the ones that shouldn't be wasting fertilizers, seeds, etc. And financial environment for sustainable agriculture, also these are being used to create the scores, for example. Finally, one of the initiatives that we have been working extremely hard in FAO with all our partners is to create a mechanism of integration and federation of solutions of data. And this is the hand-in-hand geospatial platform. And the hand-in-hand geospatial platform provides an integrated service, advanced geospatial modeling and analytics to the hand-in-hand initiative of FAO. And this is an initiative which is evidence-based and is based on territorial approaches. That's why the data is so important, but the data is public and is now available to everybody that wants to look at it. The platform integrates data on soil, land, water, climate, fisheries, livestock, crops, forestry and trade, social and economics, and much more. Technical units from across FAO support each of the different sectors of data that are being deployed. So it's not just data, it's data with technical support. And that's what brings the new value added, the new proposition that will allow us to affect and to benefit many users of this data. And for example, we can have different types of information and integrate all the data from our partners. So if you want to work on water issues, we have experts on water. If you want to work on soil issues, experts on soil, and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make, Chair, and let me finalize here, is that across all the examples I have brought, the cost effectiveness for governments and for donors is central. In all the cases, the data gaps that we have are something that we need to cover as soon as possible. But it's not only data gaps, is also capabilities, and we need to work on that, but also on assessing what national institutions of statistics are doing today, and also assessing what is the real demand of the data that really is serving and will serve for policy decision and from our farmers. It could be that we can increase savings by doing that, and we can be more effective, but we also need to understand that there are new technologies that could help, but they are not the panacea. They will allow us to close the gaps and to improve the quality. But any effort, any investment in having good quality data available and make it public will create significant benefits in policy decision. And COVID-19 has clearly shown this. So there is an area that we really need to change the way we think and trying to promote more initiatives like the 50 by 2030 and other initiatives that will allow us to have, as soon as possible, less gaps of data, more efficient use of data, and of course, more capabilities to use the data properly. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Maximo, for that strong case for the need for this new CFS workstream on data. If anyone was in doubt, I don't think anyone here has a shred of doubt anymore. Just to mention that the presentation by Maximo will be made available, as will the other presentations. And I see a couple of questions have already come in for you. Maximo will pose those to you later in the program. And now I'll move to the next part of our event, and it's looking at a conversation with a number of speakers, speaking to the points that you have made, Maximo, but also sharing practical examples. I have really 5 outstanding speakers, and each one of them will address a specific question in about 5 minutes. I won't introduce them in very many details. My colleagues will be posting their bios on the chat function, but the speakers are Marie-Agnes Juanjin from the World Bank, Cohen Doknik from OECD, Hazel Malapit from IFPRI, Brian King from the CGIAR platform for big data in agriculture, and lastly, but not least, Andre Laperriere, who is the executive director of the Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition, GODAN. And to get us off the blocks is Marie-Agnes. And Marie-Agnes, based on what you have heard from Maximo's keynote and your own experience at the World Bank, we know pretty well that our food systems are not delivering sustainable and healthy diets for all, and they are not even contributing optimally to achieving economic, social, and environmental goals. And the UN food systems that's coming up in a couple of months is going to call for bold new actions to transform the way we produce, consume, transport the food that is available to us. And how can we harness the power of data to transform agri-food systems from your perspective, Marie-Agnes?
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for inviting us to this panel today. It's quite exciting to talk to all these really great speakers today. So yes, thanks for inviting us and tell us a bit more about how, what we think about the World Bank about this topic. So yes, we have a food system that is really still struggling to meet all the new challenges. And at the World Bank, we often say that it's not fit for purpose. So we know that we need to change the course of this food system to ensure it delivers greenhouse gas mitigation adaptation for a healthy planet, good jobs and incomes for a healthy economy, and food security and nutrition for healthy people. So how can we achieve such transformation? And we know that more innovation, both technological and institutional, is needed if we want to achieve these goals. But how do we foster these type of innovations? At the World Bank, we conducted several analyses and produced various reports showing how data and digital technologies are providing new tools for this transformation. And Maximo just presented some of them. And there's openings for more efficient, equitable, and environmentally sustainable outcomes. And more than digital technologies, we know that the key takeaway message from this report is that it's all about data and the new capacity to create, share, and analyze data. And the real revolution is that the data is not only created and used on farm, but by and throughout the whole agri-food value chain, and can inform each and every step and aspect of the value chain. And this capacity to create, share, and analyze data allows dealing with many of the market failures that plague and hold back our agri-food system and result from transaction costs and asymmetry of information, which occur when one stakeholder has better or more information than another one, and it prevents profitable transactions and bias incentives. For example, a trader or consumer cannot reward with a premium a high quality product or a product meeting their environmental or social standards when they're not able to get clear or trusted information about whether or not the product has these attributes. But access to information and transaction costs are not only an issue for the private sector, they also constrain policymakers and prevent governments from adopting first best policies, resulting in less targeted policy measures, which have shown to often have unintended consequences, as governments are not able to obtain complete information about the impact of a policy on efficiency, equity, or environmental sustainability. And this could change with better access to data, thanks to technological innovation, and can trigger institutional innovation with new options for policy designs. For example, remote sensing and digital land parcel identification systems allow countries to grant direct subsidies to farmers and to enforce other regulatory measures related to the sustainability of agriculture. And so my first key point here is more that data is an enabler for new solutions and new ways of doing business, both for governments and the private sector. But the issue is not only about the creation of data, but also about innovative ways to share, analyze, and to present results in a way that makes easier to create actionable insights and customized services. Now, the first thing that comes to mind is that creating systems to allow such data-driven policies might sound feasible in OECD countries, which already invested important amounts in data collection systems to monitor the agriculture sector and their policies. But this is also relevant. And the question is this relevant to countries with less capacity and budget to spend on such tools? And in fact, the real question is whether each and every country has to develop their own full-fledged data ecosystem. And in fact, a lot of data already exists, and Maximo showed how we could display such type of data. And a lot is increasingly made available through these types of global open platforms, and we need to make better use of these platforms. And governments can use this available data as a way to leapfrog and adopt data-driven policies and actually focus their capacities and resources on creating this missing layer of data that Maximo was talking about, this ground truth data that is needed to localize the insights from these global platforms. And this can simply start with geolocalized farmer registries, allowing to better target policies to the most vulnerable populations, as well as facilitating farmers' access to services. However, it's not that simple, and many issues have to be taken care of to make sure that we can access and make the best use of these different layers of data. And for that, we need more institutional innovation. And first, one issue is that this global data landscape is still extremely scattered and not always interoperable. At the World Bank, we believe that a global public good is needed to strengthen connections and utilization of existing data products and services, and work towards avoiding redundancies of initiatives and support reuse of data. And such global public good would support an easier access to all these readily available data and analytics, both for governments and innovators. And we believe the World Bank has a role in developing such a global public good, and we're discussing the architecture of a global food system observatory with many stakeholders. Second, at the national level, governments have to adopt comprehensive and integrated data strategies. Data-driven policymaking requires a deep transformation of capacities, policies, regulatory frameworks, leadership, and organizational culture. And to identify what data to collect and make the best use of it, governments need to adopt a data strategy to put the data at the center of decision processes and to move data collection and analysis from the statistics and IT offices to the core of the Ministry of Agriculture, including with the creation of a data officer position responsible for the development of a strategy enabling agriculture government bodies to fully leverage data as a strategic asset, improving organizational decision-making outcomes, and investments in data platform as public goods. And there's therefore a need for more strategic approaches to data-driven transformation in the public sector. And I think the presentations in the next panel will allow you to hear more from what has been done in Kenya, and we had some involvement in this. Finally, and my last point is that part of this data strategy is the need for a sound data governance framework to set the rules of the road on data use and sharing between and within public and private sector. Data governance framework is the technical infrastructure and policy, legal, and regulatory framework to enable trusted data collection, processing, and reused by government, civil society, and the private sector. It defines how to handle data and extract value from data, and at the same time, reducing risks associated with data, for instance, privacy issues. And data governance frameworks are essential to create trust with farmers, communities, but also to ensure competition in the supply of digital services. And the key challenge lies in finding that balance between protecting the privacy of farmers, the security of agricultural data, and the economic interest of different stakeholders, while making it possible to leverage the potential of data for sectors' growth and innovation. This said, technological solutions might also provide a solution to this balance issue. And it's now possible to use, for example, confidential computing to provide access to data, for example, for the use for training of artificial intelligence, without exposing the underlying private data. But to finish, an important issue is that data governance frameworks are usually not decided at the sectoral level, but at the overall economy level. Therefore, the extent to which a Ministry of Agriculture will be able to develop a data strategy might depend on the broader digital agenda in the country. Nevertheless, it's important to see that agriculture sector can be a driver of decision-making in this field, and so it can be important for agriculture to push why data governance is important and why it needs to be decided for the broader economy. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maria Agnes. I think you've very complimented some of the items covered by Maximo on the case for data, but also went ahead with good practical examples, including of data and what we need, data gaps, and what we need to support countries start filling those gaps. And that, in a sense, has sort of introduced the question I have for the next speaker, Cohen from OECD. Cohen, carrying on from where Maria Agnes has left it off, what are some of the evidence data gaps in food systems, and how can we overcome those gaps?
Thanks, Maganjo, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss these issues. And I'd like to just contribute a few conceptual distinctions, which hopefully can contribute to the work of CFS on this very important topic. So earlier this year, the OECD published a major report called Making Better Policies for Food Systems. And one of the questions we're asking there is, why has it often been so hard to create better policies for food systems? And our tentative answer is that there are often disagreements on three major areas. And one is the facts, another one is the interests, and a third one is values. And in many of the most controversial policy areas, you will see that there's issues around all three of those, facts, interests, and values, and they can start to blur together. So clearly, when we think about data gaps, evidence gaps, we're sort of zooming in on that first bucket, problems around facts. And there's a lot we know about food systems, but there's still a lot we don't know either. So it's important that we address those data gaps, those evidence gaps. At the same time, we have to keep in mind that policy issues are never just about the facts. There's always interests and values that come into play. And actually, you could argue that we often have evidence gaps about those interests and those values as well. We often don't really know what those interests are, which stakeholders are affected in which way, what do citizens really think about some sensitive issues, and so on. As a follow-up of our report that came out in January, we're going to soon release a shorter note where we also want to highlight the importance of overcoming evidence gaps on food systems, reinforcing the messaging that CFS is working on as well. And again, there we're trying to make a few distinctions between different kinds of data or evidence gaps and what can be done about them. And I think one type of evidence gap or data gap is on the extent, the characteristics, and the drivers of policy issues. And for example, as Maximo highlighted, there's a lot of basic things we just don't know. Things like how many people have micronutrient deficiencies. It's surprising that we still lack some basic info on the extent of some of these problems or what's driving those problems. But one thing we want to highlight is that quite often there's an even more pressing gap when it comes to the effectiveness of policy interventions. When we know that there is an issue and we're asking what can be done about it. For example, if we give people vouchers to buy more fruits and vegetables, does that work? Is that a cost-effective solution to address some of these nutritional problems? We often don't have good evidence on that, even if we have some information on the extent of problems. Often it's the effectiveness of policy instruments where things are lacking. So building on that, you can think of different types of evidence gaps, different types of data gaps, and they have different implications for what you should be doing. So as Maximo Torero highlighted fantastically in his presentation, there's a couple of areas where we just don't know anything or we know very, very little. Data is just missing on some really major issues. In addition, there's a whole area where it's more of a gray zone, where there is some data, there is some evidence, but it's not always detailed enough to really have proper targeting. For example, we may have some information, but it's not segmented by socioeconomic status. Another issue we sometimes have is that the evidence is there, the data is there, but it's been collected with inconsistent methodologies, which makes it very difficult to compare. And this goes back to the point that Marie-Agnès was mentioning earlier, where she said that it's important that you have a way of harmonizing those approaches so that you avoid reinventing the wheel. Another aspect is that sometimes the data exists, but it's fragmented between different actors, between different public actors. Sometimes within a government, different levels of government, different agencies are simply not talking to each other, or they're hoarding their data. Quite often, a lot of information is available in the private sector, and the private sector may be reluctant to share, or they may simply lack a way of sharing. So there's a lot that can be done already trying to bring the existing pieces of the puzzle together in a more effective way. So again, for us, one issue that stands out is the importance of having evidence on the effectiveness of policy instruments. And to give you just one example, if you go to Google Scholar and you search on food waste, you'll find almost 4 million results. So there's around 4 million research publications that talk about the problem of food waste. Also, if you look at the recent UNEP and FAO reports on food loss and food waste, you'll see that they rely on hundreds of publications, estimates of how big the problem of food loss and food waste is. And then if you ask, what do we now know? Where do we have reliable evidence on interventions to reduce household level food waste? There's literally only a handful of studies available. There's about a dozen studies that have actually looked at that. So we have on the one hand, 4 million publications that talk about the problem of food waste. We have hundreds that have tried to estimate how big the problem is, but we have literally only a dozen that have asked the question, what is now an evidence-based method for reducing household level food waste? And there's a couple of other examples like this, I'm sure, across the food system. So it's important that we think not just about the extent, but also about the effectiveness of policy instruments. Now, that being said, I couldn't agree more with the point that Maximo Torrero was making about the cost effectiveness of having better evidence, having better data. And if you see how little is spent nowadays, it's obvious that the cost benefit ratio, the cost effectiveness analysis of investing more has to be positive. At the same time, we also have to understand, we have to be realistic. Everybody is working in a world with finite resources. So information, evidence, data, it is costly to collect, and it will also never be perfect. So it would be unrealistic to just wait until we have perfect information before we make a policy decision. So we'll never have all the data. So it's important that we're pragmatic. Where can extra data, extra evidence make the biggest difference? So we need to ask what are the main sources of uncertainty to designing better policies? And where can we prioritize our investments? And there's a few different ways of doing that. For example, there's an interesting tool called an evidence gap map, which was pioneered by 3IE. And it's a visual tool that helps to see where we have a lot of information already and where we still lack information on interactions or on the effectiveness of different types of interventions. So that's an interesting tool that can be used to prioritize where more efforts are needed. We've heard a lot also about new technologies and how those can help. There's one other element that I'd like to highlight, which is the possibility of using institutional innovations. For example, we know that firms have a lot of interesting information that could be used. They're also obviously reluctant to share that information into the public domain. Is there a possibility that you create an independent organization that can act as a clearinghouse, that can get the information from the private sector and that can draw the necessary conclusions that policymakers can use, so that, but without necessarily sharing that underlying data into the public domain? That could be an institutional mechanism to overcome some of those evidence gaps. As another example, in the United States, the Department of Agriculture is using a mechanism of reverse auctions to figure out how much to pay farmers for ecosystem services. So rather than having to go out and try and estimate how much should we pay farmers for ecosystem services, they use an auction mechanism so that that information is almost revealed automatically. So are there other institutional mechanisms like this that could be used to creatively unlock those data, the evidence that is currently missing? So I'll stop there. Those are just a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Cohen. Really fascinating dimensions and perspectives there, starting with how do we measure interest? Whose interest are we talking about for this transformation to happen? And the question I have for next speaker, Hazel from IFPRI, touches partly on that point that you made, Cohen, around a report that was produced by the CFS HLPE that speaks about the four dimensions, 4 pillars of food security: availability, access, utilization, and stability. But the report goes ahead to say that the dimensions we need to amplify of those pillars, and that's agency and sustainability. And isolating one group, looking at women's empowerment and gender equality. The question, Hezo, is why is it important to measure data on women empowerment, gender equality for food security and nutrition? And part 2 is how can we measure agency or empowerment of food security? Those 2 final dimensions of the 4 pillars of food security. Here's over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So we haven't heard very much yet about gender equality and women's empowerment. And in my presentation, I'd like to argue that looking at these evidence gaps, these data gaps with a gender lens is absolutely mission critical. I think the slides are in display mode. If you can please put it to presentation. We are seeing next slide. Okay, so as that's being fixed, so I just want to mention that I was quite pleased to see that in the food security and nutrition report that was just referenced, it does point to the slow progress in women's empowerment as an important barrier to progress. And why do I say that this is in fact mission critical for achieving SDG 2 is because women are in fact key actors in every part of the food system, and yet their contributions are often undervalued, unpaid, and overlooked. And so these gender dimensions are in fact very much interlocked with the entire food system, that if we close these data gaps without looking at the gender dimensions, we're going to miss a big part of the picture, and this could lead to unintended consequences. So to get this right, we do need individual level data to track progress, not only on food security and nutrition, but also on gender equality and women's empowerment. To be able to track the gender dimensions of food security and nutrition, you need to measure these outcomes for both women and men and girls and boys. You need to make that comparison to say something about gender. There's just no way around that. And this is where the WEA tool, the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index tool, is very useful because it collects data on both women and men. And these WEA-based metrics can therefore track gender equality and the transformation of gender norms. Next slide, please. So we know that we need individual level sex disaggregated indicators to inform the design of policies and programs and measure impacts of interventions. But which indicators should we therefore use? So here it really depends on your goal and what you're trying to measure. So what we found in our work is that there are really 3 broad types of goals when it comes to gender. You have programs that aim to reach women, meaning just including women in program activities. There are programs that aim to benefit women, meaning increasing women's income, food security, health and nutrition, or some other measure of well-being. And third, there are programs that aim to empower women. So these programs go beyond simply reaching or benefiting women, but aim to strengthen the ability of women to make important decisions. So not only that their nutrition improves, but that they should have the power to decide and take appropriate action for their own health and nutrition. Now, while sex disaggregated indicators on food security and nutrition can capture reach and benefit, it does not capture agency or empowerment. So the emphasis here in this framework that I'm just briefly showing you is to getting really clear on your goal around gender and making sure that the goal, the strategies and activities in your programs and investments, and the indicators that are used to measure impact and track progress are all aligned. So if your goal is indeed to accelerate women's empowerment, because that's critical to achieving SDG 2 and food security and nutrition for all, then you can use the WEA suite of tools to measure impacts on empowerment. But if your goal is reach or benefit, then the types of indicators you need to use should be around participation and around expected benefits. Next slide. So what is so special about this WEA tool? Now, this is a tool that has been internationally validated and collects data, as I mentioned, for both women and men. It was also designed using both qualitative and quantitative methods and has been applied in different country contexts and different types of agricultural development projects. So it is quite a robust tool. To date, it has been used by at least 113 organizations in 56 countries. Next slide. Next slide, please. Now, I think the most important advantage of a standardized tool such as the WEA is that it allows for comparative analyses. We heard Cohen talk about that a little bit, the importance of harmonization, right? So for example, we've looked at linkages between women's empowerment and nutrition outcomes using the WEA data in 6 countries. So Bangladesh, Cambodia, Nepal, Ghana, Mozambique, and Tanzania. Next. What we found is that women's empowerment and gender equality were positively correlated with child height for age Z-scores. So we're seeing synergies there. Next slide. However, we also found that there were trade-offs between different domains of women's empowerment and nutrition outcomes. Next. So higher workload is associated with more diverse child diets, but it's associated with lower women's BMI. So next slide. Now, having such granular information about these gender dimensions has important policy implications. The WEA can be useful for diagnosing empowerment gaps and for designing interventions to address these gaps. And it can also help demonstrate commitment for gender equality and women's empowerment and create accountability to go beyond simply reaching and benefiting women to taking the next step to empowering women. So next slide. So just to close, I hope that gives you a flavor of what the WEA can offer, the suite of tools of the WEA, and how it can help fill these data gaps with a gender lens. We do have an online resource center at wea.ifpri.info, where they have a lot of resources for potential users, including online courses through our distance learning platform. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hazel, and for sharing that tool that looks absolutely fascinating but useful, especially on a topic as complex as this. And talking of topics and approaches, to Brian King, Brian, is new data sources and big data approaches a solution to closing data gap, probably at a lower cost or utilizing platforms like the one Hazel talked about?
I do. In fact, I'm pleased that I was able to follow Hazel because I'd like to describe a bit of work that draws some inspiration from WEA while being different, actually looking specifically into that question. Can you see my screen? Let's see here.
Yes, we do.
Great. So, so my name is Brian King. I serve as coordinator of the CGR platform for big data in agriculture. We're a cross-cutting program of the CGIAR network of agricultural research institutes. And specifically, I want to look at this question a bit and just take a bit of a deep dive into big data, high volume data that's generated in the course of our, living our normal lives and conducting our activities against a backdrop of rapidly digitizing economies and societies, and look about how do we make better use of that data, specifically around decision making. So without going through the vast universe of types of data out there, I want to look briefly at call detail records. And call detail records, or CDRs, if you've not interacted with them or heard of them before, they're data that are generated by the operation of mobile phone networks. And so it's traffic between towers. It's data that also comes from individual devices. And so data, things like who called whom, from where, how long did they speak, and then increasingly there's transaction data associated with that, topping up mobile phone credit or use of mobile money for various types of transactions. And so there's a growing body of research of looking at this data and using it to try to predict things of relevance for food security analysis. And just a kind of spin through the literature, and you'll find either variables that are directly relevant to the food security pillars, or they have a kind of similar quality to variables in the food security pillars. And so things like poverty, movement of people, ability to estimate population, even things like literacy level, personality, sex, and some ways to derive some measurements related to food consumption. I didn't find too much about stability, although there's a lot of work out there about disasters, of various types, which obviously can be a disruptor to security. And so specifically what we set out to do, and why I was happy to be following Hazel, was that we wanted to see, can we develop some kind of complementary methods for understanding women's economic empowerment in agriculture? Specifically, what we did, as I mentioned, you can use mobile phone usage patterns to predict the sex of mobile phone subscribers with pretty high accuracy. I think it's like 85% in multiple countries where this has been done. And then, we also wanted to be looking at certain aspects of economic empowerment, variables that seem to have a strong relationship with this idea of agency that Hazel mentioned. And so occupation, it's agriculture. So we want to know, where we're looking, but also to see if there's some ways we can predict some things about household decision-making power and ownership.
Request that you share your screen in presentation mode, just so that we can.
Oh, did it go in the, oh no, oops, dear, let's see. Display settings, is that it? Let's see. Does that work?
Yeah, that works. Thank you very much.
Okay, yeah, all right. I'm looking at the wrong one. So the being able to use these many billions of data points generated from mobile phone networks enable us to try to derive something that we think is useful to learn things about how, in this case, women's economic empowerment may be unfolding at something like a national scale. And so to be able to test that out and try to advance these methods a bit more, we did a phone survey with 12,000 respondents. We did this particularly in Uganda, and asked some questions related to those particular variables, and also got the consent of those particular mobile phone subscribers to be using their data as part of this exercise of looking for patterns. That then enabled us to start to develop a model and try to refine a model for trying to predict what's happening with these variables. And of course, continually kind of refining and testing that model. And so that enabled us to generate a view, obviously a narrow, and it's got some inherent limitations, but it has some inherent strengths in that we could generate something like a national view really pretty quickly, and try to get a bit of kind of scale and high frequency of data available to decision making, and as I said, building on rigorous and established methods of the type that Hazel just described. And so I'll just close here. The last I think it's interesting to note one other thing that we did in terms of being able to use this data. Obviously, there are real individuals that have given consent to make use of their phone numbers. None of that was revealed to anybody. But in order, to be able to make this data relevant for decision making, what we did was essentially develop marketing profiles, archetypes, and this is just an illustrative one where that correspond to or map to and are reflected in the data of what we think is going on with individuals. And so no private data, all of the private data, the personal identifiable information remains thoroughly protected But we, are finding ways to sort of make this data available for decision making. And I think there's some really interesting complements to other research methods through this. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And it's good to see some of those examples coming from the field and the tools that you are deploying. And you cannot speak about data without a question of privacy and the responsible use of that data and the fear or apprehension that people sometimes have sharing such information freely with others. And there's a question to Andre at Godan. I know this is a critical component of the work you do, but how can we ensure open access and responsible use of data for food security and nutrition?
Thank you very much. Just 1 second, I'll try to get there. Yes. I think one of the keys answering this question has to do with the concept of data-driven agriculture, because that concept embeds both challenges as well as promises in the same statement. Promises, they come, of course, from data. What you have on the left side is based on a survey we did a little while ago, the list of the types of data that seem to have the greatest impact on agriculture. Impact being anywhere between 15 and 30% improvement in terms of yields and profit, which are quite common, especially based on the geodata, weather data, and markets data, which are the three big ones in the whole list. On the right-hand side, you see different types of impact it can have, but the promises are really on the left side. If we find a way to generate and obtain reliable data, timely data, accurate data, and useful data. But the challenges make it sometimes difficult. We know, for example, that the average age of African farmers is 58 years old. So these farmers are getting older. So we have to do something to rejuvenate the age of these farmers, bring in the youth that tend to be more technology oriented, for example. We know that in Africa, 90% of African farms are very small. They're 2 hectares or less. 80%, in fact, are 1 hectare or less. So these are very small farmers that do generate data that we need to be able to manage the agricultural sector the way it should. At the same time, demand on food is increasing exponentially, just looking at the demographics and seeing how the world's population is increasing, especially in continents like Africa and Asia. And then, of course, we have climate change that's causing some difficulties, and the digital fracture, the digital gap, which Hazel mentioned earlier in her presentation. Just to quote an example, we know that if you're a man in sub-Saharan Africa, you're twice as likely to access technology than if you were a woman. However, we know that 80% of all food jobs in sub-Saharan Africa are occupied by women. So you see right there, there's a discrepancy that harms, that interferes with a satisfactory food sector management. Now, here's a reality check. It's good to say, okay, now we have all this data, this geodata, there's all kinds of data that's available and that can generate up to 30% improvement. But when we talk to the 1 hectare or less farmers, false farmers like Bob, and we tell him, Bob, you have all this data that's right there, that's available for you. You can see right there that there's a reality gap. So part of the challenge and of the promise is to find a way to get these 80% farmers, these farmers like Bob, to be able to generate the data that we need to compile to have an overview of what is happening in the sector in a way that motivates him or her to do that. And the way to do that is to ensure the proper feedback so that he doesn't just generate data, but he gets something in return. So I'll come back to that in a second. This concept, though, of data-driven agriculture also involves responsibilities, because once you get into very granular data, you run the risk of exposing some of your sources, some of your small farmers to praise, so to speak. For instance, if we know that there is an infestation or a drought or something in some part of the country, we can know which farmers are really in trouble because their farm is really suffering more than the others. There's always people that are looking for opportunities like that to prey on these victims and benefit from that. So those managing the data have an extended responsibility to make sure that we do no harm in the way we manage data. We can aggregate data that we release, but whichever way we do it, we have to make sure we do no harm. Now, here's the 30% improvement. This is an example of in 2017, we did a comparison, and that's in Meknes in Morocco. We compared the two key crops, wheat and lentil production, compared to how it was 5 years before, while they were using traditional farming methods, while in 2017 using precision agriculture and other data-related techniques. As you can see, the production of lentil, for instance, on the right, has been multiplied by 5. That's on the same piece of land using the same resources, and despite erratic precipitations and other complications that came since. This is another example of the promises that's in South Africa. As we know, they've had some serious drought problems. What the little color spots that you have are fields. This is a picture taken by satellite looking at the moisture of the soils. The plan there was to help reduce water consumption by 30% over 3 years. They manage through involving the farmers and providing this data to reduce this water consumption by 30% over 18 months, not 3 years, but 18 months. And moreover, we managed to reallocate those water savings to other areas that were not well irrigated before. So as you could see, it was a double win using technology brought in a format and a manner that made sense to these end users. This is another one. Maximo was mentioning one of the difficulties getting data from countries because of all kinds of reasons that he elaborated on. But while we should still continue to enhance capacity of countries to generate their own data, meanwhile, there are ways to, I wouldn't say circumvent, but to temporarily address this. And again, using geodata, for example, here we have Ukraine. As we know, satellites used to be increasingly good at determining where things are growing or not growing, and if they're growing better or not better than before. But they weren't so good in differentiating, let's say, soya versus maize. But now they are. It's possible to calibrate the signals we get from the satellites to the different types of crops. That's what you have here in this example from Ukraine. And from this, you can see that you can generate forecasts that are pretty accurate. In this example, up to 90% accuracy in terms of the crops that you have in this part of Ukraine. So while we're waiting sometimes a year or 2 years to get the final data, we can still use other means to make accurate crop forecasting, which are useful for pricing, for imports, for exports, for managing the ag sector. So let's use technology to advance immediately required action and support that with capacity building and formal data coming up later. Another example of bringing data in the hands of the farmers in a manner that makes sense to them. This is using artificial intelligence and image recognition on the left to identify invasive species, on the right, invasive insects. So Bob, he can just take his phone, take a picture of the insect that's eating all his crop, and immediately identify what it is and how to get rid of it. So that's an example of big data right in the hands of the farmers without going through the whole complication of data analytics, because AI and other levels can do it for him. For those who don't have smartphones or lower technology, this is an example from another of our partners. 350,000 farmers in Africa are using this approach with old-styled phones, whereby on the left, they get agriculture and weather-related information, like in the case of this lady, telling her, wait until you plant your pineapples because the rains are delayed. Wait until 1 more week. And on the right, when she's ready to sell, then she gets the prices for the pineapples in the 10 markets that are nearer to where she is, so she can get better money for her crops. This is the last example. This is also for nomads or for pastoralists. This is in Mali, very successful project also, which involves both satellite data as well as crowdsourcing. The idea is that these nomadic populations, they have to go from one grazing area to the next. And because of climate change, sometimes they would arrive in the next grazing area to find that there's no more water and that there's nothing to graze. So the cattle losses were very high and the hardship was also very difficult. Now, making a partnership with Orange, the phone company, and the Dutch Space Agency, we managed to provide these pastoralists with information, which would tell them, don't go to this grazing area because it's dry, go to that one instead. And where the crowdsourcing comes up is that not only do they receive in this information, but it's not just passive, it's active. Because if I'm going from spot A to spot B, and I have 3 heads of cattle for sale, I can inject it in the system. So all those that are connected to this will know that there's somebody coming to area B with 3 heads of cattle for sale. So you see, there's an additional motivation, a link with crowdsourcing, and an overall satisfaction from the users here exceeding 95%. So a good example of providing data, but also stimulating the beneficiaries to provide data themselves and to in turn feed the system and get it going. So these are just some examples as to what is the key. The key is to make sure that we motivate those that have the data to generate it and to share it because they get something in return. And also at the same time to manage, to encourage, manage, I'm not sure if it's the right word, those that manage data to do it in a responsible way and making sure we do no harm in the process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andre. And it's really good to see, especially those examples of data at a very localized level using technologies that can be accessed by most people involved in food production. And another point where you said what the key is, Andre, I have a question for you and for the rest of the panelists. The essence of this conversation is to inform the CFS policy recommendations on data. How do you see the policy recommendations contributing or supporting to address all the issues and challenges you have spoken to? I'll start with you, Andre, in a minute, and I'll go to around the table to all our other speakers. Andre?
I think we have to convince, to educate more, build the capacity with policymakers to make them more sensitive to the use of data. We have to work with the senior technicians, those that feed policymakers with data so that they do it in a format that makes sense to them, makes it appealing and makes it really useful. So that's the second element to this. The third one is more of a technical way. As I tried to demonstrate in correlating geodata with traditional data, we have to not just convince policymakers to start using estimates while they're waiting for the final data to come in so that we can make projections and adjust before it's too late. So it's taking action before the fact instead of corrective measures. It does involve, though, some technical measures. So because the estimates are what they are and they need to be readjusted over time. And it means that for a while you have 2 sets of data, the forecast and the actual, so that you have to reconcile. And finally, geodata does not know borders. And as we know, sometimes there's a discrepancy between what you see from the sky and the official land demarcations on the ground. So there's a bit of technical work that needs to be done there. But the way to the future goes that way, and it's available to us right now. So, maybe one last point. Maximo was saying that, 30% of the countries only do provide data. Well, satellites go to over 100% of the countries. So let's make use of it. So that's good for the countries that still struggle to generate data, but that's also good for all those involved in helping meet SDG 2.
Indeed, very practical examples of what we can do and how we can utilize the policy recommendations. I'll go to the first speaker, Marie Agnes. On that question, how can these policy recommendations be used?
I'll try to be brief because I think there's many of us. So I think ultimately there's really a need for a change of mindset. As I was saying, we really need to see and change the way we're perceiving the use of data in Ministry of Agriculture. And it really requires a change and a deep transformation of capacities indeed, but also policies, regulatory frameworks, and leadership and organizational culture. You know, there's often this legacy problem that's also very difficult to take into account. So there's really a need for a positive story for everyone, you know, in the ministry to really accept change too, which is sometimes very difficult. And just an extra point with data and digital, usually the devil's in details. There's been a lot of excitement for a long time, around all this, but I'll just give you one example of how difficult sometimes it is to implement. We've all seen during COVID the importance of e-certificates, and there's been a boom thanks to a new initiative from the with the e-certificate hubs, with the IPC and the FAO. But I found a paper from 1995 that was already talking about these e-certificates. It took so much time to actually get there. So it's all about the policies and the complexities of discussion, the complexities of change of institutions. So best practices and really providing a guide of how we do this and what are the elements that you need to look into to get that transformation and really create this positive view of how you can create that transformation, I think is quite essential. That will be on my side. Thanks.
Thanks, Marie-Agnes. Cohen?
Thanks. Building on Marie-Agnes's point that there's been a lot of excitement about these new technologies, big data, digital, and so on, I think I'd like to see one point that also says all of that is really important, but in addition, don't forget this question of evidence on the effectiveness of different policy instruments. And that is typically something that is much harder to just get from satellite data or big data efforts. And sometimes it's really, quite often I would argue, it requires an experimental mindset where you just try things and measure them in a very rigorous way. Because we also know that a lot of initiatives may work very well in one context and then completely fail to take on in another context. So it requires local evidence. So it requires also a very different skill set, again, even apart from the capacity to analyze big data and so on. So it's yet another capacity gap that is involved. So I'd just like to, it would be terrible if we end up with a situation where we know exactly what the problem is, but we still don't know how to solve it.
That's true. And Hazel, what's the take on how we end up utilizing these policy recommendations, especially on the gender disaggregated and gender-based data?
Yeah, so I think at the minimum, if we're collecting individual level data, it needs to be sex disaggregated as a standard. I think that's just full stop. That needs to happen. On top of that, we do need to measure agency of women specifically, but also, in relation to all these other groups that suffer from marginalization and inequalities. And so I think the way a tool, while it's primarily focused on women's empowerment, can actually be quite a broad tool to look at these other broader equity dimensions. The third thing I just want to say is that we are also developing a more streamlined sort of women's empowerment metric for national statistical systems called Women's, and this is in collaboration with the 50 by 2030 initiative. And so this is really a tool that is ongoing. It's under development, but the goal here is to use that as a sort of really nimble, streamlined tool for tracking SDG 5. So I think those three things would be very useful. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Brian?
As I alluded to in my talk, I think that there's this space around development of methods and validating methods of how can we use this, ocean of data that's kind of generated in the course of our economic and social lives effectively and responsibly. And I think related to the responsible part, one area that is sort of developing now is related to Hazel's point about agency. Individuals need to be recognized as owners of their data, and we need to find new ways to manage the consent and the right to revoke that consent for use of that data in ways that make sense for stakeholders. And only that I think will start to get us the right relationship with individuals and their rights and the kinds of services or decisions that we'd like to be able to inform that we hope will be of benefit to them.
Thank you very much, Brian, and to all the speakers. I can almost hear Fabio scribbling down most of these points that are coming through as he's our lead on this work. And before we transition to the next panel, I know Maximo had to leave a little earlier due to another engagement. But Jose Moncayo, who is the head of the statistics division at FAO, is online. And there are lots of questions to Maximo after his presentation. I'll pick one of them, which was, probably speaks to the reason why 30% of the countries haven't collected enough data, as he mentioned. And this is a question from Dr. Marceline Tonye Mahop. And Dr. Mahop says, on the underlying causes of data scarcity, how about some countries' competing development priorities? Does this fall under Maximo's three main underlying causes of data scarcity? Some countries are very poor and need basic social and infrastructural development needs, roads, schools, hospitals. So there's this competition for between collecting data and needs for developing a country. Jose, how do you respond to that, and how do you see the work that you are kicking off contributing to addressing some of these gaps?
Oh, thank you very much, and hello to all. I'm Jose Roser Moncayo. I'm the director of the Statistics Division of FAO. Definitely. So let me tell you from my experience, okay? Before being the director of statistics in FAO, I was actually the head of the National Statistical Office in Ecuador, a developing country. And of course, at the moment that you are at the head of a national statistical office, you understand basically all of these competing priorities, okay? That basically you have to respond. Even if it is there is a well-defined national plan inside of a country defining specific priorities, you will find that you have 200 of these so-called priorities. And at the end, you need to give a response to the majority of them with very limited resources. All of these anecdotes to say that indeed is one of the limitations, especially if we compare with different type of domains or areas that you will say that they are more, let's put it this way, that they are more sexy from the point of view of the type of information. And here I am talking about statistics in education, statistics on health, that in terms of developing countries potentially can be considered with good reasons to be of a highest priority, that information that has to do with agriculture and food. Nevertheless, of course, I will not be a good director of statistics in FAO if I will not know how to make a good case on collecting food and agricultural data. And of course, here the link of agriculture with livelihoods and poverty is very important to make. We know that for the most of developing countries, the agricultural activity is one of the most important activities that contributes to the income and the livelihoods of people in the country, especially in the rural areas. Policies to eradicate poverty need this type of data desperately in order to be able to design and implement and monitor cost-effective policies. So while it is acknowledged that the different type of competing priorities that are there, there is always a good case to make in order to collect agricultural food and nutrition data, not only at the level of the farm, but actually at the level of the whole value chain if we think in a food system kind of framework. Over.
Thank you very much, Jose. And just to mention, as we come to the end of that first panel discussion, the many questions that you have posed will be responded to in good details in the next hour from 5 p.m. The session that will be anchored by Bernard from the HLPE will look at speaking specifically to the questions that you have posted. I'd also like to encourage our speakers, if you can, please respond to some of those questions on Q&A directly. Those that we don't respond to, we will respond in writing and post them on the CFS website in the summary report that we produce following this event. Now, I will shift to the second and the last panel conversation, discussion. And this panel is looking at the use of data for increasing food and nutrition security and accelerating food systems transformation experiences from countries or some case studies. And to help us through this conversation to share experiences, pleased to have Ms. Tule Leneya from the Ministry of Agriculture in Kenya, heading the Agricultural Transformation Office. Tula, is very good to see you. Speaking from Nairobi in Kenya myself, it's good to see Kenya represented. We have Najiru Sal from ROPA. I'm not sure Najiru is on the line. We have Rikin Ganthi, who drives the work of Digital Green. Thank you so much for joining, Rikin. And finally, we have Pat Mooney, who is a co-founder of the ETC group. So I'll quickly go to Tule to hear a little bit more about Kenya, and I'm excited about this. What is Kenya doing to foster the use of data in agriculture? How is data, supporting the agricultural sector transformation and the response to COVID-19? How are you using data on all this?
Thank you so much. Sorry for that. We're just having power issues today in our side of Nairobi. So I'll just take you through my presentation with regards to the ATO and the work that we're doing at the Ministry of Agriculture with partnership through CALRO and the other sagas, as well as the World Bank, IFAD and AGRA in particular. So just to give you a bit of context, digitization became an anchor within our ASTGS, which is our 10-year strategy. It's the agriculture sector transformation and growth strategy. And it is specifically anchored on the creation of a commercially viable and modern agriculture sector. And for that to happen, we recognize that there is a requirement to look at data, have digital interventions that will collect the data, or at least integrate the ministry with where the data comes from. And so part of the work as the Agriculture Transformation Office was to implement the Kenya Unified Agriculture Data Platform. And so what we've been working on when we started, unfortunately, when the ATO started, it was during the time of the COVID pandemic as it started. But to be honest, there was a silver lining to that in terms of really kicking off our focus on digital and data collection. This is just an illustration of how the food security war room we established with the support of AGRA and MasterCard Foundation in particular, ensured that we could connect with over 50 stakeholders. And this really illustrated to the ministry in itself that we are maybe not the best generators of data. The best is to then work with stakeholders and partners, coordinate with them, and use and access the data to then be able to identify where we can intervene. So we worked with development partners and NGOs. I saw one of the questions to Massimo was on whether NGOs play a part, and play a very big part. FuseNet gave us a lot of information with regards to markets, where product was available. When we worked with the private sector partners, we were able to geo-reference and from geospatial initiatives to identify which farmers had food, which markets were open, where the product was, and then the ability for private market aggregators to then get the food to collect the produce from those farmers, but also get it to the markets. And then as government, our intervention was just to make sure that we could enable all those players to then be, to access food. Because as much as data and digital are available, food is food is food, so you need to be able to collect it, you need to get it to the market, you need to get to the people to feed our communities. Another initiative that we managed to implement last year as part of our drive for digitization and data availability was the e-voucher program. Now, the e-voucher program was the move of our physical subsidies for support to at least 1.4 million farming households. And now we're diversifying from just crops into livestock and fisheries producers. And it allows for us to create a farmer registry. How can we then, people always say, how do you ensure that you have not duplicated support? And you can only identify whether you've duplicated, support because you have the data on the farmers. Yes, we also ensure that we have anonymized the data. We do not share this data with anyone, even though the agro dealers do have to receive someone's ID to confirm that this is the genuine redeemer of that e-voucher. It's not stored anywhere except at Ministry of Agriculture. through the Calro big data platform. And we're now working on a performance management structure with Calro through the systems that we're implementing, working through a product called Kiamis that was supported by FAO. They are the main, FAO is the e-voucher lead globally, but also working with private sector partners like Safaricom with their DigiFarm product. Sorry, this is the power coming back. And other service providers, as well as our private sector input providers, and now looking at how do we widen the scope of our e-voucher program to crowdsource digital advisory services. Because as government, we've recognized that there is a minimal, there's a reducing investment in extension services. And since it is now a devolved function, which means that it is the county levels that implement extension services to our farmers, we're crowding in private sector, looking at where the digital support comes in, and ensuring that you create an enabling environment to then provide that extension, or rather advisory services to our farmers, which then creates the opportunity for advisory to be ran by the youth, right? I heard one of the other speakers saying, how do we then crowdsource, how do we bring back the youth into agriculture? And we've recognized that in some of the counties where it's been piloted, it has only been the youth who have done well on this digital advisory services. And it is true, our average age farmer in Kenya is 65. So you can imagine in a few years' time, or even if you try and deploy a platform on a mobile phone, if it's not USSD or SMS, it's likely to fail. But when we have brought in the youth, we have seen development and support, and the older farmers, the wazés as they're called, now coming on board and really appreciating the support that youth can give in agriculture. And then finally, like I mentioned, the Kenya Unified Agriculture.
Your audio tapered off a bit.
Sorry, like I said, the power situation. You know what we're dealing with.
Clear.
Can you hear me now?
Faintly, with a bit of echo.
Okay, then I didn't change anything. Yeah. So finally, I wanted to illustrate the Kenya Unified Agriculture Data Platform. We recognize, like I said, that government is not the creator of data, but the aggregator. So this platform is to then crowdsource information from KNBS. We work with our Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, from Calro, KRA, which is our Kenya Revenue Authority, as well as I heard someone talking about satellites and the availability of geospatial data, and integrating all that information through batched data and real-time access data, creating a data lake, and this will be hosted at Calro as well, because we recognize that we need to now start leveraging our investments and ensure that we are not reinvesting and not recreating the wheel, and thus, being able to implement all our use cases from our digital strategy, which came out of the ASTGS. And right now, for example, we have already started working on the visualized data dashboard and have support from the National Agriculture Statistics Services from the US Department of Agriculture to help KNBS, KRA, and our internal statistics teams build the capacity to then have our agriculture census, ensure that we can process the data, because like Massimo mentioned earlier, you can collect data, but if you don't know how to apply the economic models to it, if you don't know what to do with that data, then you just have data for data's sake. And then finally, for us, it's important for us to build resilience in our ag data and digital interventions. So as mentioned, the skills, we certainly need to ensure that we build the skills. We're only starting that journey now. We need to create an enabling environment. We have recognized that we cannot have a national data strategy without collaborating with others, and hence the way the Kenya Unified Agriculture Data Platform works. And finally, Innovate, innovate, innovate. We've also agreed within ministry that we need to design more flexible engagements with our partners. You know, as a national government, we've been quite rigid for a lot of time, thus left behind in a lot of those innovations. And then also looking at sustainability. We recognize that there is resource constraints. How do we leverage the resources that are available? How do we motivate for more resources? And the only way you motivate is by illustrating. So this is why we keep running a few pilots. It's now time for scale, and recognize that although a lot of our decision makers are senior, they have seen that there's an importance for data and digital innovation, which will ensure that we can invest further in the systems and allow for people to enter the market. Thank you. Thanks, Njoroge.
Thank you very much, Tule. Innovate, innovate, innovate. A good place to wrap it up. And I can testify to this being Kenyan. There's quite a lot of innovation coming from the office that you drive, Tule. Good work, and you get to see lots of young people getting involved in the digitized side of agriculture. I go to Rikin, who is also working with small holder farmers through his institution. Rikin, how are you supporting farmers to control and securely share the data they have across food systems? And this is tied to the question we asked to Andre of Gordon earlier.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And the work I'm to share today is supported by the Gates Foundation and UK Aid, and is in very close collaboration with the Ministry of Agriculture in Ethiopia and others. And essentially the challenge that we're trying to solve, which certainly builds on what we've heard today, is how can we enable data sharing within this broader ecosystem of government, private sector actors, and civil society to have trustworthy ways in which they share data with one another. In our own work at Digital Green, we have primarily focused on improving the efficiency of agricultural extension services in partnership with various governments in both Sub-Saharan Africa as well as in South Asia. And primarily this is involved using videos by and for farmers to share best practices more efficiently. And it's reached a fair amount of scale with more than 2 million farmers and more than 46,000 odd extension agents involved. As we've been doing this work, a ton of data is being generated, data about what this content is featuring, in what crop, in what season, what individual farmers are getting exposed to different pieces of information, what their feedback is, what the practices that they actually apply or adopt on their farms are. And that then helps to inform the extension systems. But of course, there are so many more actors. We're just one, and there's many more government, civil society, and private actors in this space. And so what we've sought to do with FarmStack is to create an open source protocol that can, in a trustworthy way, enable the sharing of data across the ecosystem. Since we recognize that it can't be just one single actor that is going to aggregate everyone's data, we need to think about how can we drive complementary ways in which data can be shared, but in a way that protects the individual interests of the respective organizations and individuals. And at the end of the day, flips the paradigm wherein data today largely is extracted from farming communities, whether it be for monitoring and evaluation purposes or for the provision of various types of other types of services, but to place the data rather in the hands of the farmers themselves, in a way of a farmer data wallet where the farmer can choose how they want to leverage their own data, whether it is to connect to a government extension service, whether it is to avail a credit score for getting a bank loan or the like. And so the problem that we're trying to solve is at an ecosystem level, we see a proliferation of innovation and new services, which is extremely exciting with all the new talent and financing that is coming into these markets. But at the same time, it is fragmenting the ecosystem in another way. And then there are issues around trust and compliance, including with the GDPR, as well as data protection bills in Kenya, in India, and other markets. There's issues of how do these service providers make sure that they are in compliance with the privacy and other types of requirements that are being orchestrated by government policy. And then finally, how do farmers gain control over their own data so that they can maximize its value, whether for decision-making or even for monetization purposes for themselves? And just to share in two layers at a platform level where you see applications, whether that's on credit, information, or offtake market side, there is a great set of activity taking place at that top level. But at the lower level, we believe that there needs to be more action in terms of creating open source protocols that can enable the wider ecosystem. And we see this in other spaces, like in the healthcare space with standards like HL7 and others, but we don't have so many of these open source protocols in our agricultural space, which can drive greater coordination and complementarity across our respective efforts. And so what we're trying to do with FarmStack is to create an open source protocol that essentially creates a codification of a governance schema where organizations can have trust about who are legitimate actors that they can share their data with. And we can codify the type of legal data sharing agreements that might exist today in software and enable the data to be exchanged not through Digital Green or any other central broker, but rather peer-to-peer, that organizations are able to share data with one another on their existing infrastructure. If they are on the cloud, they can use the cloud. If they're on local devices, they can use that. Or if they're on the blockchain, they can use blockchain, whatever type of infrastructure they are on, and be able to share data with one another with these usage policy rules, and enable farmers to be able to have this farmer data wallet and have the ability to consent with respect to who they want to share their data with, and have the ability to discover other entities that they might want to connect with. And just to show how it sort of looks in practice is that a data provider, whether it is a farmer or an organization, is able to share their data directly to a data consumer, whether that is a data consumer who's trying to build a machine learning algorithm or a government extension service who wants to use that for providing precision agriculture advisories, but do it in a way that the data provider is able to give their consent and codify the rules on which how their data can be processed, whether their data can be stored or forwarded, can be enforced, again, in software. To give a concrete example, in Ethiopia with the Ministry of Agriculture and with an NGO called Precision Agriculture for Development, we're linking together the farmer hotline that exists in the country that reaches more than 4 million odd farmers, their 8028 service, with some ground level data that is generated from village savings and loan associations about the gender of various individuals. But we want to be able to combine this data to give custom gender responsive dairy advice to farmers without exposing their personally identifiable information. And with FarmStack, we're able to combine these two data sets together without exposing the sensitive information, and where farmers are able to consent to saying what of their data are they willing to share, and be able to also give their feedback about how they utilize this information for their own farms. Finally, as we think about this larger network that we see being built out, we really believe that ministries of agriculture are in a great position to be stewards for this overall network of farmers and organizations sharing data with one another in a secure, trustful way, peer-to-peer, with the codification of these usage policies. With that, I'll encourage all of you to check out FarmStack. All the code is open source, and would welcome your feedback. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Rekin, for a great presentation and very nice background with birds chirping in the background. Some good soundtrack coming from your end. I'll go now to Pat Mooney, and Pat, we sort of have saved you for last because of the topic that we'll be speaking to, which is giving us a reflection, your own reflection and the reflection of your own institution about all that which you have had and ensuring data safety, especially in getting farmers engaged. Pat, unfortunately, we can't hear you. Please unmute. Still not. Try again. Can someone please unmute, 'Pat', on our end? Can someone please unmute 'Pat' 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 on our end? Can someone please unm I will try and unmute you. Still not much luck. He must have sent you a message, Pat, requesting that you allow us to unmute you. We still can't hear you, Pat. No. Try again, please. Probably as Pat tries to unmute, maybe Pat, best to get your assistant who joined us yesterday to help with that. And as you do it, and once you're online, just shout, we will get the floor back to you. I'll ask the question I asked the first panel around, based on the experience you have at the country level working with farmers, how do you see the policy recommendations you're working on supporting you in your work? And I'll start with you, Rikin.
We see the policy really being influential with respect to determining how these data protection rules are codified and how the interests of farmers are maximized. Certainly, as Maximo shared, there's obviously value of aggregate data for policy purposes or for machine learning purposes, but we really believe that there's an important role that policymakers can have with respect to making sure that data can become a new asset class for farmers. And there's a need to think about the legal part of that and policy, but also the software element to make sure that those legal or policy elements can actually be enforceable, such that, for instance, farmers can monetize their own data.
Thank you, Rikin. Tule? Tule, you are muted.
Sorry, John. Sorry, could you just repeat the question? My apologies.
No worries. The question is based on your experience with the work you're driving with Kenya's agricultural transformation strategy and the challenges you're likely to be facing on data. How do you see the policy recommendations that CFS is starting to develop through this process, helping, supporting you to better do your work? And we'll come to you, Pat. Please keep your microphone open as Tule makes his quick intervention. We'll come to you in a moment, Pat.
The joys of digital working. Anyway, look, we're very excited about the CFS support. This is like I'm sure this is you guys unveiling to the rest of us how we can move forward. As you know, we're looking at our migratory pest challenges. We need to establish an appropriate early warning system to make sure that we have data availability for policy interventions for us to be able to then ensure that we make the right investments on what's required. If is it fall armyworm? Is it issues with regard to desert locusts? Is it issues with regards to floods or drought challenges that farmers are facing? But I really appreciate Rikin's additive on farmers controlling their own data. For us, it's also important since Kenya has ratified GDPR. And we're working out appropriate governance frameworks so that we can absorb, congest, consume, and process data without infringing on people's personal and privacy issues. But it's also important that we identify and target the right farmers. And for us, policy issues relate to double dipping and making sure that we can spread the wealth and availability of support to as many farmers as possible. Thanks, Njoroge.
Thank you very much, Tule. Pat, let's give it a shot and see whether we'll hear you now. Unfortunately, we still can't hear you, Pat. You probably might want to plug in the mic again. Try. No. Is it only me who can't hear Pat? No, Pat, we can't hear you, unfortunately. Still no audio. Don't give up yet. Don't give up yet, Pat. We really want to hear what you have to tell us if you still can hear us. All right, Pat, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up this part of the program, and we'll come to you. Please, when you're probably log off and log in once again, Pat, and we'll keep trying. When you're on, we'll give you the floor no matter where we will be on the program. But just to say, I'm really delighted to have had an opportunity to engage with such wonderful group of speakers. And you can be sure that we'll definitely reach out to you as well as our participants. At some point, we had about 300 or so people on the call. And as we get to the final hour of the event, I'll be introducing my colleague and a member of the HLPE steering committee, Professor Bernard Lemon, who will take us through the deep dive, reflecting on the questions that you have posted. We'll try to speak to as many of the questions that you sent to us. We'll give some of you the floor if you raise your hands or if you request for the floor. And the essence of this engagement, as we said at the beginning, is to inform CFS's new work stream on data. And again, this work will be started or will be kicked off with a report by the high-level panel of experts. And so everything you have given to us will be utilized. We might be reaching out to you once again for better consultation and deeper consultations and engagement, just to ensure that we are capturing as many thoughts and views, suggestions from the ecosystem. So it's now my pleasure to invite Professor Lemon to drive the next segment of the program. Over to you, Prof.
Unmuted. Alert, your default speaker has changed to speaker/headphones left pair. Right pair, audio right pair, and will now be alert here.
But sorry, I have had to mute you. There's such a loud sound coming from your end. Sounds like there's something else playing in the background. Probably we'll try and
Should I start?
Just start, Prof, and whenever Pat is able to connect, he will connect.
Thank you so much, Vayango. Let's start with the general discussion, and Pat will join us later on. I welcome you all for this open discussion and thank in advance to the CFS Secretariat for the support. You all can still contribute with questions and comments in the Q&A function. As you have heard, the steering committee HLPE will producing a report on data and data gaps together with a project team over the next 12 months. Today's webinar provides us a very valuable guidance on this. We had really very interesting inputs of all of the speakers. Consistent and complete data for all aspects of food security and nutrition are crucial for the best possible policies to achieve the SDGs, and in our case, especially SDG 2. As it has been mentioned by Wanganyo earlier, HLPE requires that food security and nutrition must additionally be captured with agency and the sustainability. Agency is very closely related to the preconditions for access to food, and sustainability in the long-term aspect, which gives greater weight to the ecological dimension. We received questions in the box. Please continue to ask questions. I will go through these questions and give the floor to the panelists for the answers. But let me start with one general question to the panelists. I would start with the question how you access the data situation around the 6 dimensions of food security and nutrition, including agency and sustainability, and in which dimensions of food security and nutrition do you identify especially data gaps or not optimal used available data? Who takes the floor for this? Would you start, Gordon André Lapierre? He disappeared.
He is muted.
Okay, he's muted.
So sorry about that. I was going to say that there are many avenues where data can be optimized. The use of data can be optimized. I mentioned some in my presentation whereby obtaining data still is a challenge because the feedback, the retroaction to those that can provide the data is still very weak. So that's one area. The second is the cross-referencing of data. I just gave an example. There's a country I was interacting with not very long ago, which according to statistics was exporting more of one of the crops they were producing. They were exporting more than what they were producing. So you can see by cross-referencing exports with local production, you could see that there was a mistake there. So cross-referencing different sources, whether traditional sources, that's probably the easiest part because we're more or less used to their format. But with the development of technology, cross-referencing with new technologies like geodata in particular provides with all kinds of new avenues, especially when we bring in artificial intelligence, which helps us manipulate much greater volumes of data, much more complex, and translate them into simple conclusions, which is really what users, end users, be it policymakers or farmers, are going after.
Okay. Somewhere else on this point?
If I may jump in. Hopefully I'll be on point on the question.
Yeah.
I think that it's more, I mean, what's interesting is what Brian has been showing us about how you can use very different types of data to generate insights. And I think the difficulty we have today is to really identify how all these different types of data can be used and what they can tell us. And one gap that we can see, I think, is more about finding all these data and knowing a bit better exactly what they can tell us and what kind of question they can answer. You know, who would have known that the data that Brian showed us could tell us so much about gender? And I think this is this gap that we need to fill, you know, taking the data for example, GSMA, I remember, had presented how you could use the sound waves from their towers to predict weather, and you know, in a very short run. So it's about trying to get the people who have the data to tell us better how we can use it, be really creative about how we can use it, find the right people to be creative about how to use it and explaining better, you know, capacity building here about explaining and finding ways to explain how you can use that data to answer your question. That will be on my side. Thanks.
You are muted.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I muted myself. The floor is still open on that point.
I raised my hand.
Yes.
This is Jose Rosero.
Yes, please. Jose. Yes, sorry.
Okay, I think that it's important to think in the two aspects that we have discussed today, right? So one is the data gaps that exist and in which dimensions, as you were asking, data is more needed, or there are bigger gaps. And the second one is how to make a better use of the data that is actually available, okay? Because in reality, even if there is big data gaps, there is data out there that is not used in the most effective way. So that's the second thing to think about. So in terms of the data gaps, I mean, it's difficult to say in which kind of dimension of food security there are more gaps. I think that the point that Maximo was doing in his presentation is that even in the most traditional areas, such as food availability, there is still important gaps. And these gaps are characterized by a lot of heterogeneity. Countries, some countries really producing data in a timely way, and some countries actually not producing data at all, or doing it not in a way that is accurate or is timely. So I think that the examples of basic data such as agricultural production or agricultural trade gives a very good indication of what is the status of even the most basic data that we need in order to say something about food security and nutrition. In terms of utilization, this dimension of utilization, the scarcity of data in terms of diets, diversity of diets, quality of diets, and nutritional outcomes is even more worrisome, right? So in that sense, every single effort that is needed in order to collect data that is also the individual level, I think that is an important way to go. But though that in terms of the data gaps, now let me just have 1 minute on the more effective use of the data that is actually available, and that's why it's important to work together on the better use of data that is out there. And here I'm referring to use of technologies and sources such as big data. So we have to work more in trying to web scrape, text mine, use artificial intelligence, use remote sensing in order to be able to fill the gaps and also take advantage of the information that is out there. But nevertheless, let's have in mind always with big data and data science that even if that promise a lot, okay, and of course it encompasses a lot of opportunities, there is also a lot of big challenges in terms of the use of that kind of data sets. And because of that reason, investing also in traditional ways of collecting data, and here I'm talking about surveys or administrative registries, it doesn't have to be forgotten. Sometimes we get very much into the issue of the big data and how to better use this type of source of alternative data sources. And sometimes we forget that there is a good investment as well to strengthen the traditional data collection means. Over.
Thank you. I see that Pat has the hand raised. Is that for the presentation?
Yes.
Why don't you, or a question or an answer?
I was hoping to have a chance now to make my intervention, and my apologies for the problems we've had. Can you hear me okay?
Hello, we hear you all right, Pat, but there's a bit of echo in the background, so just keep your intervention brief. Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay. Thank you very much. It's National Day in Canada today, and I think my computer went on a holiday, but it's back. There were 3 points that I wanted to raise, and as I listened to the other panelists and very much appreciated their comments, I think they become even more important in my mind, at least. And there are issues around the governance of big data. The first is that, of course, there's a lot of data that's been gathered. A huge amount around food and agriculture is just not in the hands of governments, or at least all governments. There's 2 major sources of data which have naturally been collected, first by governments with a global security concern that collect data in many different ways and have been for many years. Much of that does relate to food security concerns. Secondly, of course, there's the data that's been created and managed by the private sector. And that comes in several important categories, which they are not necessarily entirely aware of themselves. We have, for example, the asset management companies such as BlackRock and Vanguard that have collected enormous amounts of data because they have shares in all of the major agribusinesses around the world. Secondly, we have the data that's been collected by the agribusinesses themselves, the Cargills and the Walmarts of the world, who naturally have their own commercial interests and gather the information they find to be important for their commercial activities. And thirdly, we have the data that's been collected by the cloud companies, the data cloud companies such as Amazon and Microsoft that gather that information through their systems. All of that data is there, but it does have in it, and I recommend that this be a concern of the high-level panel of experts, when they look into this issue, which is the issue of the biases in that kind of information, intentional and unintentional biases, because the orientation is towards commercial data. Those who are food insecure and smallholder producers aren't part of that data for the most part, so they're left out of that information. And it means then that the advice that's being given when the private companies talk with governments is advice that is skewed towards the commercial information that's available, the commercial data that the companies have, not necessarily the data that governments need to have. So the need to know what that information is, to understand the gaps in the data, to understand the errors that perhaps can arise in policy because of having access to commercial data, but not having access to the data that's really important to marginalized peoples around the world is a critical area. A second critical area is to recognize that the data is most urgently needed and needed to be exchanged in a secure way among those who are food insecure and those who are smallholder producers in their own territorial environments, their own territorial markets. They need to be talking to each other, be aware of the needs, be aware of the risks and opportunities that they face, and addressing those issues. That means that they need to trust one another and have secure systems for that information. And they need to not only deal within their own territorial markets, but smallholder producers need to be aware of both what is happening with other smallholder producers in other ecosystems, similar ecosystems, and in adjacent systems. So they can exchange, for example, climate information about pests and diseases, information about seeds and livestock breeds that they can use to adapt to new conditions and new changes. That exchange among those communities and their organizations is absolutely vital for the food security of every country and the planet. And that needs to be understood as their system that needs to be under their control. And then thirdly, we have the area of national governments and the United Nations system, multilateral institutions, who of course need to have information and work with data and the most secure data possible. And we've heard a lot about that already. But that information and that data system needs to be recognized. Two issues need to be understood here, I think. And this again, I address to the high-level panel of experts. And that is that recognize the problem of mission creep and recognize the problem of data leaks. Mission creep has happened in data management systems all over the world. And we've seen it very recently in the healthcare system around the world, where information collected for one purpose is suddenly used for another purpose, unbeknownst to those who donated the information in the first place. We see that, for example, in the case of the United Nations, where both the Biodiversity Convention of the United Nations and the FAO Plant Treaty have encountered the problem of digital sequence information, where again, information that was collected, biological materials, seeds that were collected, now have other applications and can be utilized in ways which were not foreseen originally by governments or by the international community. And that creates new problems. Mission creep arises from that. It's almost impossible to avoid. So the question for the panel is, high-level panel of experts, is how can they help us to avoid that? And how can they make sure that smallholder producers and the food insecure will be safe through that? And then, of course, it's the data leaks issue. And I don't think any of us can think of a sector of the economy or a sector of government that hasn't been subjected to either data ransoming or data leaks of some kind or another in the last few months, last few days even. It's a constant experience that we have. It's one that hasn't been solved by anybody at this stage yet. And it will require a lot of attention by everybody before any of us can fully trust an information system that is as pervasive as we would like it to be to give us the information we need to have. So then the 3 points are for me: one, to understand that there's information that's been collected, which perhaps distorts policy now, and that data needs to be understood clearly. Secondly, that the data that's most urgently needed is that among local communities and local producers, so they can work together and exchange through their organizations. And thirdly, that national governments and international organizations need to be aware of the natural risk of both mission creep and data leaks. Thank you for your time. I'm sorry that I had so much trouble getting on.
Thank you, Pat Mooney, for your presentation. Questions will come later on for your presentation. Could I give the floor to Giancarlo from the WFP. Are you online? Yes. You have to unmute, please. Giancarlo.
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. So thank you. Very interesting presentation and discussion. I would like just to highlight some points. The first is mostly that we still focus too much, in my opinion, on the agriculture sector. I think that the other dimension of food security in terms of data are really in very bad position compared even to the agricultural statistics, and mostly for nutrition data is not available, very poorly available, and even for access we have a lot of problems in this kind of data sets. So the gaps are quite strong in all the points that we have discussed, and the solution we are suggesting, both with Earth observation, the new satellite, fantastic outputs, and big data, that can help really, but it's something that I can say in some realities in the countries where we are used to work, this tool doesn't really always work. Can you imagine the poor, the smallholders in some region cannot apply really something that using Earth observation data to detect, to do yield forecast, because there are a lot of problems with crops. We had some experience on that, and in generally, that's the main issue to data. I think that one of the points that I think is not being stressed enough is the involvement of the local authorities, because not just the Ministry of Agriculture that is usually the entry points, but also the other socio-economic ministry, line ministries, and health that are fully involved in food security. And I think at the end of the day, this is the real source of the data also in a perspective of sustainability. So we need really to strengthen their capacity and to get them really involved and committed in this kind of activities. Otherwise, we will find a solution, very nice pilot, very nice approach, but then as UN, we cannot always, I think, close the gap. We need support from the country, and we need to support them in developing this capacity and get the full commitment from them to face the hunger. This is what just I would like to say.
Thank you so much for your comment, Giancarlo Pini. This is also very important regarding the scope of the report of HLPE. We have agriculture, plenty of data, and we have downstream with less data, also concerning consumer and consumer behavior. This leads me to a question from Arti Krishnan of the University of Manchester to Massimo, to Jose Moncayo. It's the question around what does FAO for the downstream data get collecting? Jose, are you online?
Yeah,
yes,
I'm
yes.
online. I'm online.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can you be more specific in terms of downstream?
Yes. What's about downstream data around food tech, retail of food, including distribution, processing, consumption, especially considering small firms, including them involved in retail?
Okay. Okay, it's a good question. So one of the biggest initiatives in which we are involved, and this together with our colleagues in the World Bank and IFAD, is the so-called 50 by 2030 initiative that Maximo presented as well in one of his slides. And he was not lying when he was saying that this is the biggest initiative in terms of data collection that the world have ever seen. Okay, in the world of agricultural statistics. Mm-hmm. One thing that we have to understand, nevertheless, about this survey is that the unit of analysis is the farm. Okay, So, and that gives us a lot of advantages, but also provides some kind of constraints. From the point of view of the advantages, will give us, I mean, this type of initiative will give us a lot of information about, and will fill a lot of data gaps of what is happening at the level of the farm. Okay, and here I am talking about not only the typical production data that is happening at the level of the farm, but also economic variables, environmental variables, social variables that relate to the specific agricultural activity. What are the limitations? The limitations is that we are talking about one specific segment of the value chain. Okay, so this initiative will not basically cover the rest of the steps in the value chain. But nevertheless, I will still say that there is actually most of the gaps that we have right now still happens at the level of the farm, and that basically is what this specific initiative intends.
Yeah.
Now there are, in terms, just let me give another example of other type of initiatives that actually do cover other segments of the value chain, and that's basically the initiative that we have put together in order to collect data on food losses. And this is very important because food losses can happen in different parts of the value chain, not only at the farm level, but in different type of levels, including retail, for example. So in that sense, we have put together an initiative that collects this type of data, take advantage of big data techniques and data science techniques in order to be able to collect information that is around, coming from different type of paper, different type of research, different type of studies that have been basically developed in order to collect food loss data in different type of commodities, in different type of segments of the value chain, in order to create a big database on food losses. And that is a database that is already available. People can basically go and see this type of data set, and now is the basis in order to report one of the SDG indicators in terms of the food loss index. Over.
Thank you very much. I give the floor to Hazel, who has an example on women empowerment on the base of the data collected in Bangladesh.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to that point about how do we use the data that we're sort of arguing we need to collect. And I think Bangladesh presents a really good example, because when they first started collecting the Women's Empowerment Index for the Feed the Future initiative back in, I think, 2012 or around that time, they not only collected it in the Feed the Future zone of influence, but they also collected it nationally in a nationally representative survey. And what that gave them is the ability to look at the interactions between women's empowerment and nutrition. And they found something really striking. They looked at empowerment outcomes, and they saw that even in the poorest regions, when the women were empowered, they also saw better nutrition. And this was a puzzling result, right? And in fact, that finding actually led a pilot study that's called the ANGEL Project, Agriculture, Nutrition, Gender Linkages, which is a partnership between IFPRI and the Ministry of Agriculture. It was a randomized controlled trial that sort of looked at different types of interventions around agriculture, extension, nutrition, behavior change communication, and gender sensitization. On the strength of those pilot results around gender, the Ministry of Agriculture actually scaled that up. And so this is, I think, a really good example of where, you know, having this data at that granular level, you know, in a nationally representative sample, really driving evidence-based policy. Thank you.
Thank you. We need good case studies for our report. We will come back to you later. Brian, your hand is raised.
Hi there, thank you. So I think once again, I'm happy to be following Hazel because she's really demonstrating the you know, the kind of nuance and ability to sort of reveal how food, you know, systems flow, how gender flows in food systems in ways that we absolutely need to be able to do. And we need to do it more quickly. And so just as a kind of building on that, you know, I wanted to make an observation about how when we're talking about mobilizing data, we often, you know, kind of arrive at the point pretty quickly of how complicated it is. And we quickly arrive at the point of how, you know, we need to be responsible and ethical. And those things are absolutely, you know, valuable and they must be part of the discussion. But what happens sometimes is that we start to stop thinking less about how do we claim the benefits, how do we actually mobilize and make use. And what I would like to also underscore is that we all know it's a very rapidly changing space, and policy almost by definition is going to be a step or two behind what responsible behavior is. And so what I think we're needing, you know, to be able to respond to the urgency of dealing with food systems and their complexity and nuance, and dealing with the potential for unintended consequences, what I think we need is more agile governance. We need the ability to constitute and move beyond agile governance groups around particular problems where we have stakeholders. You know, we need coalitions agile coalitions that can form and disband as needed around these things, because policy and even our ethical frameworks, for that matter, are probably always going to be, you know, a step behind. But if we're going to, you know, use these data effectively and respond to the urgency of doing so, we also need to step up our models and our approaches to governance into some kind of more agile fashion. Over. Thank you.
Thank you. This leads me to a question of Liz Steele, a question for all the panel. From each of your perspective, what is the one single thing that will be enabled to better production and use of data for agri-food system at the country level? And the question has a second part. What can the CFS do to make it happen? I see IFAD Emily Hogg, you have your hand raised.
Hello, sure, thank you, Bernard. Yep. So thank you. I currently am the manager for the data use program at IFAD for the 50 by 2030 initiative. And so I wanted to bring in another perspective. A lot's already been said about the initiative. In addition to it being you know, a unique thing being the large size of the program, another unique aspect of the initiative is that when we were designing it, and at that time I was seconded actually to FAO, and we were working on the design of the initiative, the partners felt strongly that we needed to have a specific emphasis about the data use, not make assumptions about the data production, and that simply filling in the gaps was going to get us to the place where the data would be used. And I think previously in the sector, and a lot of things indicate this, there was that assumption that we could take a supply side approach and this would miraculously lead to data-driven development and data-informed decisions, and it just doesn't. And we know that. And so what we've been doing at IFAD is developing this new program, developing not just the approach to promote the data use, but a conceptual framework behind it, really understanding how to make the decision makers that we want to reach, both in the government, the private sector, intermediaries in the academic sector, in the media, how do we promote those linkages so that while FAO is working on the supply side with the data production, we can set up the intervention, set up the ecosystem so that the decision makers will want to use the data, have demand for the data, and know how to integrate it into their processes for planning and policy making or investment decisions. And so that is, it's something I think that's really unique in the sector, that we have developed this theory around it, and it's available on the 50 by 2030 website and some of the products that we have. And I'd encourage others to look at it because we have we have spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, and I think it could be a basis for potential solutions in the future with the sector of how we get decision makers to use the data. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we come to Kern from OECD, which has a balance between policy failure and data gaps.
Right. I know the question was, what is the one thing? I have three different things, so I'm just going to go ahead anyway. There's too many interesting things to limit ourselves to just one, I think. Building on Hazel's example of this link between women empowerment and nutritional outcomes, there's one thing that we definitely shouldn't forget in the work of CFS when we're focusing on SDG 2, but the essence of food systems is about these interactions, these spillovers, and these connections between environmental sustainability, nutritional aspects, livelihoods, etc. So it's important that we keep that holistic view, which CFS and the HLPE have always been very careful about. But also when we're asking about data gaps and how to overcome those data gaps, it also means we have to keep this in mind. So it also means what are the data sources or the pieces of evidence you need to bridge those different domains? So how do you get information on sustainability aspects of a policy that would improve nutrition and so on? So that's just the first point there. A second point is, and this is, I think, something where CFS can play an important role, is to emphasize the importance of investing in data and evidence. And I feel that we're a bit in a similar situation to the question of public investments in agricultural R&D. So if you look at the scientific literature on that, there's a broad consensus that governments are under-investing. And there's recent research that quantified that for the CGIAR R&D, that the benefits are 10 times larger than the costs. So this is the median estimate. So some projects have even larger benefits. So it's clear that this is a fantastic investment. And still, for some reason, it's very difficult to convince policymakers to put that money in, because that cost today is very concrete. It's very clear. And something similar is true for investments in data. It's very clear the budget for statisticians and for statistical offices is very concrete, whereas the benefits are going to come in the future. It might be very hard even in that case to exactly quantify them. And it is true that it's really hard to quantify that. And so I tried to find at some point some evidence on what is the literature on the benefits of investments in statistical capacity and so on. And the answer is, in many cases, we don't really have clear numbers on the benefits, except that we know that the costs are relatively small compared to what must be the advantages. So for example, Maximo Torrero mentioned that only 0.3% of all official development aid is going into data and statistics. So this means that as soon as that investment is improving the overall effectiveness of the ODA spending by just 0.3%, then it's already paying for itself. So clearly it will have a better impact than 0.3%, right? So clearly the benefit cost ratio is clearly very positive. But some of the benefits can be very far in the future. So in the United States, the Department of Agriculture has been collecting data since the 1860s. So you can do analyses that span more than a century. That's a wealth of data, and it means that 100 years after the data was collected, we can suddenly do analyses and see how historical climate variation has affected agriculture in certain places. So the data might be useful for questions that we don't even have right now. So it means that the data can always be useful in the future. So potentially the benefits are infinite. So, but it makes it very hard to give a concrete business case today when we're arguing for more money there. And a final point I wanted to make was building on what Emily just mentioned now. There's a discussion going on right now in the context of the UN Food Systems Summit about how do we strengthen the connection between science and policymaking. So, and I think the terminology that is emerging is the science policy interface. And so there's interesting discussions happening now about how do you embed the science better in the policy process. And it feels that there's a very similar issue about data. So it might be interesting to link up those discussions. So that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you. I will come back to those who have raised the hand. I have a question from Rodney Cook, CGR system and CIP. The question is to André and also to Cohen. Both have gave interesting example on promise, impact of big data on agriculture and policy effectiveness. Thus, in this year of COP26 on climate change and policies for countering climate change, can they comment on promise of data for advancing COP26? Would you start, André?
Sure, and in fact, it links to a point I was going to raise there. First, on the COP, as we know, the COP is always a very high-level forum, which is very important. We are working with FAO and other partners at what hopefully will become the Glasgow Declaration, which is in the spirit of a number of other ministerial declarations that were enacted in Nairobi in 2017 and Accra 2019, etc., whose purpose is to get governments to harmonize their data-related practices and work together. So to make data flow more easily, because think of data related to climate change, infestations, and other issues that don't know borders anymore. So hence the importance of doing that. But the point I was going to raise beyond that is that there is an interesting phenomenon happening in terms of data nowadays, is that as technology brings us many more promises. So we spoke of artificial intelligence, geodata, big data. Indeed, very important because it allows us to cross-reference a number of different data sources and bring conclusions or analysis that would have been impossible just a few years ago. This is all exciting, but sometimes we're getting too excited maybe because if our focus becomes exclusively almost on data systems, there tends to be at times a gap between us systems people and the little farmers of Africa or other places, which are sometimes disconnected from that. So to make a long story short, in my opinion, the one factor that can make a big difference nowadays in many countries in making data, putting data to use, is use cases. You know, the farmers like this lady I had in my presentation, she doesn't need the whole weather map story. She just needs to know if it's time to plant her pineapples or not. So we have to be a little bit humble in terms of use cases and agree that out of this massive data that we can gather, individual users sometimes have very pointy, simple questions that maybe use a very small fraction of all this exciting data we've put together. But in the end of the day, that's the kind of difference that will make the difference in the field and for all of us.
Thank you. Koen, have you an additional comment to this?
Not really, actually.
Thank you. Can I give the floor, Giancarlo Pini? You raised the hand for a long time.
Yes, thank you. It's just you asked before some use cases, so
yeah,
it comes to my mind the experience in WFP with the anchor map that I think most of you knows, and so I would like just to give a quick overview. That is idea real-time food security data collection that we are running on 35 countries, and is done through a computer-assisted telephone call and through the call centers. So data is collected on a rolling basis, let's say, and through the service providers, and telephone numbers are randomly selected. At the end of the day, the questionnaire includes household demographics, household food consumption, coffee strategies, whatever, access to food, whatever is necessary for it. Can be also different for the different countries. This allows really to, in our system, to have an update of the situation that, let's say, is up daily, but in the reality, a kind of monthly. This was firstly designed for countries with conflicts or some epidemics where it was impossible to go. But now, as I said, it's about 35 countries that are where we are working. So it's growing slowly. And I think it's a good example. And if you are interested, you can have a quick look on the website. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Can I give the floor to Pat?
I want to come back to the earlier question about what specific advice would we want to give to the HLPE as they begin their work. And I think the most important point I would want to make is to focus on, again, smallholder producers and marginalized peoples, those who are food insecure, and to remember that you know, that terrible saying that says that if you're not quantifiable, you're not considered. In the case of marginalized communities, if you're not commercial, you're not considered. And I think they must recognize that the data is distorted now. is available, and that that has to be changed, has to be understood, that has to be changed, and what needs to be produced now is something which works for and is trusted by and is controlled by the smallholder producers and the food insecurity in the communities.
Thank you. You underlined the importance of agency in food security. Let us come to a question of Baha Ray Sarvi for Marie-Agnes. What data is collected to measure the effectiveness of the foundings of World Bank provides for the economic growth of smallholder farmers in agriculture-based developing countries?
Oh, well, I am absolutely not able to answer that question. There's a lot of data being gathered for all the projects. Of course, there's impact assessment. I must say that I believe that most of the time there's a lot of it which is ad hoc. The World Bank has a lot of data. To be transparent, I think at this stage we still have to make a big effort to better connect this data ourselves within our institution. This is something we're looking into. And full transparency, maybe I'm not old enough at the World Bank to know about all these nitty-gritty. So I don't know if anyone has more information than me on this. But since I have the floor, I'm sorry, I'm going to take the opportunity to come back on some other question that was raised earlier. And there's something a word that quite a few of us have used, or an expression quite a few of us have used, and is not coming back to the floor in the conversation, which is institutional innovation. And whether it is the discussion, that was brought from the 50 by 2030, the discussion by André on use cases, I really would like to insist on the fact that, yes, we do need to collect a lot of data, but I agree with them. We need to bring it to the people who are going to use it. We need to make it to do the analytics and manage to find ways to showcase how to use these data, bring it to the innovators so that they can provide these services and customize these services. So if we don't integrate that thinking and what usually the community calls human-centered thinking into the data collection, we might miss the point of exactly which type of data we need to collect, where we need to put our resources. So I very much agree with the strong focus on use case here on this issue. Thanks. Over.
Thank you. I have a question from Nicolas Kerandi for Tool LNA. The other day, I saw an ongoing conversation on social media about how the government was using farmers' registrations. I think in this case, it was targeted at green ground farmers as a way to widen the tax net. What is the Ministry of Agriculture doing to sensitize the population the importance of having data on farmers in the fight against food insecurity? Are you still online, Chule? It's not the case. So I can come back to another question.
My apologies.
Oh, sorry, you're here. Yeah.
No, well, there's been some challenges here. Sorry, I just heard Marie's question, but funnily, I didn't hear mine.
Okay, so that it is a national question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe you can answer her in the written form.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. A question to Pat. We have a question to Pat. Don't the benefits of accurate agricultural information outweigh the theoretical risks? Are you here, Pat?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes, we hear you.
I mean, the answer has to be that not so far. We have a huge amount of information, as I said before, both in the private sector and in the hands of at least some governments, that would be very helpful to all governments and smallholder producers to have access to, even if it does have a certain natural orientation towards the interests of those who produce the information or gather the information. But we haven't found it to be beneficial so far. And we need to then be building a system, which and FAO is in a great position to help with that, that will make it beneficial to smallholder producers and to those who are food insecure. But what we have seen, both and FAO has the experience, as does the Biodiversity Convention and the Cartagena Protocol and in the Nagoya Protocol and in the FAO Plant Treaty, where information has gone awry, where in the end, unavoidably at that time, news information has become available, news tools have become available, which lead to the distortions of information against the interests of both indigenous peoples and smallholder producers. So at this date, we can't be convinced that the creation of new data without a new kind of governance model will be in the interest of solving the problems of world hunger.
Yeah, thank you. A last question for all panelists. Feel free to give an answer from Veronica Villa. In a context where the legislative framework for data collection is very weak, how do we deal with the fact that the private sector controls far more data from food systems than public institutions? I think this question is addressed to all, because you deal with that challenge. Jose Moncayo, yes.
No, thank you. So the issue that the private sector has basically the power and the means to collect data is not necessarily bad, right? So I think that the private sector needs to collect data in order to do what they have to do, and also to give their contribution to society. But the important thing is how, okay, the public sector or the society as a whole can take advantage as well of that kind of information that the private sector produces. And that is basically when the importance of doing partnership, public-private partnerships is very much important. And there are examples of that, and of course, more examples are needed. Now, it is important as well for sure to give some kind of balance in this type of data asymmetry, okay? Mm-hmm. So the public sector needs to invest more in data, and here we're talking about data of agriculture and food. So it's important that the public sector made its share in order to ensure equal access to data. So more investment, more public investment in data goes and contributes to that. Now, international organizations do our share at the moment that we provide, okay, technical assistance to governments, especially in developing countries. That's the way that we also contribute in order to balance a little bit this type of apparent disbalance.
Yeah. Okay, we have still 2 speakers. Time becomes scarce. Could you also involve the question of pastoralism with a sector with very weak data in your answer, if you can? André?
Thank you. Well, first, the first question, I always get nervous a little bit when I hear the word control data, because when you control data, in a way you endorse it. So if you endorse it, you have to make sure the data is correct. So therefore that it's been curated somehow. So that's a major undertaking on one hand. Second, some countries have tried to go with good intent, I think, to establish a system by which they would control, data would be controlled and quality would be somewhat ensured, but inadvertently it was perceived as an attempt to provide censorship. So instead of encouraging or facilitating the release of quality data, it discouraged the release of data, especially research data altogether. So we have to be a little bit careful with that. We have to see that in the private sector, there are basically three types of data. There's internal data, like their financial data, for example, that they keep to themselves. Then there is data that they generate for the purpose of their clients, which is normally somewhat limited in terms of release. And then there's general purpose data that is free to the world if there is a recipient to receive it. And on this, I was going to quote the Netherlands as a good example, where they opened up their government data cube to the private sector. So in enhancing this public-private sector data sharing system. Pastoralist, the same way. And the Garbal example I gave to Mali is a good example of that. The government of the Netherlands, through their space agency, a private company, Orange Telephone, the users which designed the system, the pastoralists themselves. So pastoralists are often forgotten, but they're an important part of the economy in countries like Africa. So they have to be part of it. And again, they have to be involved, empowered in creating systems that are designed for them.
Thank you. Hazel?
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to point everybody to one of the solutions around data that's being put forward as part of the UN Food Systems Summit process. There is a solution that's called a digital, let me get this right, it's called a Global Food Systems Data Consortium. And it's actually trying to solve this very problem that was just raised around how do you sort of overcome these barriers around data sharing, recognizing that there are different actors that are producing this data and there are different users of this data. And so I think that solution is really trying to build a consortium that will work on solve the problems of interoperability. So building kind of a technological solution around making this data talk to each other. And then also solving some of these incentive issues around sort of what are the common rules that will help even private data producers and public data producers to kind of put all their data together so that whoever needs to use the data can then use, analyze, visualize this data. So just to say that some of that thinking has actually been raised as well in the summit. Thanks.
Thank you. We come now to the conclusion of Jose Sumsi. Let me thank you so much for all what you have brought in this session, the questions, and also the great inputs and answers from the panelists. That was really great and useful for us. And give the floor to Jose. Jose, please.
Okay, thank you, Werner. Well, a lot of issues, topics, and problems has been presented and discussed today. It's a very rich discussion and session. I think that will be very interesting to improve the report, because almost everything that the report considered has been commented today. The first question is a clear fact that I think is the most important element in the work stream proposed by CFS. It is the lack of data and statistics on food security and nutrition in many developing countries. The figures presented by Maximo was really amazing. 30% of countries that are not production in agriculture, 35% in trade, 50% in nutrition, is really a very difficult and concerning scenario. And it's for that one of the most important elements is the necessary improvement of the capacities in countries. We need three elements that presented by Maximo to improve the lower statistical capacities. In fact, the main element of the work stream is how to improve this capacity at country level, capacity to collect, to analyze, and to use data. And I think this is a very important element that will be part of the policy recommendation, how to improve this capacity. This will be a very important core of the policy recommendations of the report. The second question is the problem of the lack of data is poor funding on data and statistics. It is mentioned several times, the problem of funding. I think also compared with some other priorities, developing countries need a lot of investment in other fields. And with the scarce resources, this is difficult to assign more and more financing to data and statistics. But this is a question maybe to be presented and to be proposed at global level. And maybe one of the questions that will be in the report, in policy recommendation, will be to create some kind of international financial mechanism to improve data systems in developing countries, especially in the more poor countries. And the third question is weak dissemination. I think that maybe initially in our report, dissemination is not a core issue, but after here the discussion today, I think that we need to introduce and include this question of the problem of data dissemination and data access. Because if the data are not accessible, are not disseminated, this is really a problem, although the data exists. Next question is the integration of traditional and new methodologies and technologies to produce more and better data in a cost-effective way. I think that we need to integrate the traditional and the new technologies and methodologies in a way that really you can make more cheap the cost of getting statistics and use the statistics. Another question that was discussed today is innovation. Innovation, I think that is a very important issue. Initially, we focus in the report in technological innovation, but the discussion today is also putting a very important innovation that is institutional innovation. Then we try to reinforce this approach, not just of technological innovation, but also institutional, legal, and governance innovation. I think this is a very important part, and we will reinforce in the report. Another important and interesting debate is about private and public good. Data is a private and public good. And we discussed now recently, in the last part of the discussion, the question of the problem, how to combine private data and information and public data and information, and the difference of resources from private companies and public investment, especially in developing countries. I think this is a very particularly important. We need to get this question in our report. Of course, it's a public good from the point of view of governments and policy making, but also it's a private good. And there are some private companies collecting and disseminating data as an activity of the private sector. I know, for instance, even in some countries in Africa, some companies that are collecting from farmers and disseminating to the farmers information on markets through the mobile phones. And these are private companies, not public companies. And we need to, from the point of view of governance of data and legal regulations, to treat this problem. And of course, as Jose Moncayo said, probably we need some partnership between private and public sectors. Another question, agriculture is not just the core of the data. We need to move from agricultural data to food security and nutrition data and food systems data. And talking about the 6 dimensions of food security and nutrition that CFS and HLPE has recently in the report 15 on narrative. We need to take in consideration all the 6 dimensions. In that sense, the presentation from Hassel about this Women's Empowerment Index is a very good example to be included in our report, to how to measure the agency is one of the 6 dimensions of food security and nutrition. I think this is a very interesting question. You know that we need to put a lot of examples of good practices and success stories in our report, and some of the stories presented today really is very interesting for the report. Effectiveness of policy intervention was presented for OECD. I think this is very important. How to measure the effectiveness of the policy interventions and policy recommendations, not just what kind of policies we need, but how effectiveness is in this intervention, policy intervention. Harmonization of the methodologies is another question that we will mention in the report. We has foreseen a section on this question of harmonization. And finally, I think that the question of the importance of big data on new technologies is also discussed today, very widening, especially in some examples, for example, call detailed records, CDR, presented by CGR, or digital revolution from Godin, or green digitalization. I think that all these examples are very rich and will be included in our report because are very interesting examples. On the farmers, small farmers are not just users, but also are producers. There's this dialectic from users and the same time producers we need to take in consideration and to preserve the farmers as owners of this information, but at the same time to ensure that they will be the users of this information, that they contribute. As some presentation said, the producers and users at the same time, the empowerment of the users as an active participants rather than passive data subjects. I think that this is a very important. Questions from privacy, questions for ownership are very important on that, and again, reinforce the role of the governance in data systems. Finally, I would like to inform you of the next steps of the HLPE report. The steering committee has just finished the selection of the project team leader, that is Carlos Cafiero, from the statistical division of FAO. I think he's a magnificent project team leader. And we also selected the project team members that will cover all the fields and topics included in the data collection analysis report. The next step will be the refining of the scope of the report and drafting a noted outline in July 2021, let's say this month. From August to October 2021, the project team will draft the zero draft of the report. In November, December 2021, the HLPE will launch the e-consultation on the zero draft. From January to March 2022, the project team will draft the first draft of the report. In April 2022, the first draft will be evaluated through a peer review process that will be, as usual, very important. And finally, in July 2022, the report will be validated in May, June 2022, in May, June, the steering committee will validate the final version of the report. And finally, in July 2022, the report will be ready to be launched. With this, I think that I finished my intervention. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you, Jose. Thanks again to all speakers. Thanks to the very active audience. Thanks to the translators and also for the Secretariat CFS. We had a great webinar with you with extremely useful outcome for our HLPE report. With these words, I have the pleasure to close this meeting. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.